Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nobody prepares you for how ordinary everything feels right before your world shifts. February morning, downtown Cleveland, and I'm sorting through campaign metrics while the coffee maker gurgles its usual complaint. Marketing assistant, 4 months into the job after finishing my degree at 31. Finally getting my life together after years of bartending and bad decisions. Our office sits on the 7th floor of one of those interconnected downtown complexes, where 3 buildings share a parking garage, and you can walk between them without ever going outside. Glass windows floor to ceiling on the east wall, perfect view of the Huntington building across the plaza. I remember thinking how the frost patterns on the windows looked like tiny cities, spreading across the glass while steam from my mug fogged up a small circle where I leaned against the window. Everything changed when the first patrol car screamed into the plaza below. Then another, then 6 more, all at different angles, officers jumping out with their weapons drawn and pointing at the Huntington building entrance. Diane from accounting pressed against the window next to me, her breath coming quick and shallow, leaving larger fog circles on the glass. We watched a SWAT van pull up, officers in full tactical gear pouring out like ants from a kicked hill. Someone behind us dropped their phone, and the crack against the tile floor made everyone jump. Through the frost and fog on the window, we could see people streaming out of Huntington's side exits, some running, some walking backward with their hands up, all of them being directed behind the police line by officers gesturing frantically. Our floor manager, Kevin, burst through the stairwell door, face flushed and tie crooked. "Active shooter in Huntington," he said, voice cracking on the word shooter. "Lock down, everybody away from the windows into the conference rooms now." But we stood there for another few seconds, mesmerized, watching the chaos below like it was happening on a screen instead of 70 feet away. A woman in a red coat stumbled out of Huntington's main entrance and collapsed on the sidewalk, 2 officers rushing to drag her behind a police car. That made it real. That made 27 of us scramble away from the windows, knocking over coffee cups and scattering papers, cramming ourselves into the 3 conference rooms on the west side of our floor. The smell of spilled coffee mixed with sudden sweat and fear. Conference room C became our world. 15 of us packed into a space meant for 8, sitting on the floor with our backs against the walls, knees drawn up, trying to make ourselves small. Nathan from IT had his police scanner app running on his phone, volume barely audible, crackling with codes and street names I recognized. "Suspect last seen heading toward underground parking level," the dispatcher said. Multiple buildings connected via lower level. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, that specific frequency that usually annoyed me during long meetings but now seemed like the only normal thing left. Diane sat next to me, her fingers wrapped around her ankle so tight I could see the white crescents of her knuckles. She kept whispering about her daughter at daycare, how she was supposed to pick her up at noon, how the daycare would call her ex-husband if she didn't show up. The scanner crackled again. Suspect entered Building 3 through maintenance access. Building 3. Our building. Nathan's hand trembled as he fumbled to mute the app, but we'd all heard it. The air in the conference room became thick, like breathing through wet cloth. Kevin stood up, pressing his ear against the door, then quickly sat back down when footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Not running footsteps, just regular walking, which somehow made it worse. The footsteps paused right outside our door. I could hear breathing, or maybe it was my own breath bouncing off the wall behind me. The door handle rattled, just a small movement, like someone testing if it was locked. Diane grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging crescents into my skin. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and then the footsteps continued down the hall. We stayed frozen for what must have been 5 minutes but felt like hours before we heard it. A door slamming open somewhere down the hall, followed by shouting. Not police shouting, Not commanding voices, but panic. High-pitched screaming from what sounded like the accounting department, maybe 40 feet from our conference room. Then a loud pop, another pop. The screaming stopped, replaced by a different kind of sound, muffled sobbing and whimpering. Heavy footsteps again, slower now, methodical. They stopped at each door, testing handles, getting closer. Someone in our room, I think it was Brandon from sales, started hyperventilating. Nathan clamped his hand over Brandon's mouth, both of them shaking. The footsteps reached the conference room next to ours, room B. The handle turned. That door wasn't locked. We heard chairs scraping, people scrambling, a woman's voice saying, "Please, please, please," and then 3 quick pops. Something heavy hit the shared wall between the conference rooms, sliding down with a sound that made my teeth ache. Our door handle turned. The lock held, but the door shuddered as something slammed against it. Again. Again. Each impact made the cheap wood flex inward. Kevin crawled toward the door on his stomach, reaching up to brace his hand against it, trying to hold it shut. Another slam. The wood around the lock started to splinter. I could see a crack forming, spreading like lightning through the white paint. Diane had her phone out, texting something, her thumb moving in quick jerks. "Love you, baby girl," I saw on her screen before she hit send. The slamming stopped. We could hear breathing on the other side of the door, ragged and heavy. Then footsteps again, but running this time, getting distant. Shouting from far away, professional voices this time. Police commands echoing through the hallway. More running, organized and tactical, boot falls in formation. 20 minutes passed before the police knocked on our door, identifying themselves, telling us to open slowly with our hands visible. They moved us out in a line, hands on our heads. Through hallways I walked every day but didn't recognize anymore. The accounting department door hung off its hinges. Dark stains on the gray carpet that my brain refused to process. In conference room B, paramedics worked on people I knew, had eaten lunch with, had complained about the broken printer with. They wouldn't let us look, kept us moving. But I saw Melissa's yellow cardigan on the floor, the one she wore every Monday. Outside, the February air hit my lungs like ice water. They herded us behind the police line where HR representatives with clipboards were taking names, checking us off lists, handing out emergency blankets that nobody needed but everybody took anyway. The news trucks were already there. Cameras pointed at us like we were a story instead of people. A detective took my statement while I stood there shivering. Not from cold, but from something else. Something that made my muscles contract without my permission. He asked if I recognized the shooter when they showed me a photo on his phone. Douglas Brennan, he said, worked for Huntington, recently terminated. The face meant nothing to me, just another downtown office worker, forgettable features, could have been anyone in the elevator. But then the detective asked about Jason Huang from our purchasing department. Did I know him well? Had Jason ever mentioned problems with anyone from Huntington? Did Jason seem worried lately? Jason, who hadn't been in conference room C with us. Jason, who I hadn't seen during the evacuation. The detective's questions painted a picture I didn't want to see. This wasn't random. Brennan had come for Jason specifically, through 3 buildings and 7 floors. They kept us in the Marriott lobby across the plaza for 6 hours while they processed the scene. Pizza appeared at some point, sitting untouched on folding tables while we sat in clusters. Some people crying, some staring at nothing, some calling family members over and over just to hear their voices. Diane finally reached her ex-husband, who picked up their daughter, and she cried so hard she threw up in a wastebasket. Nathan kept refreshing news sites on his phone, reading updates about our own experience like he needed confirmation it really happened. 3 dead in Huntington, 4 in our building, 11 injured. They didn't release names yet, but we knew. We knew Melissa was gone and Robert from conference room B, and Jason, who Brennan had hunted through 3 buildings. Around 8 that evening, they finally let us collect our cars from the parking garage, escorted in small groups, walking past yellow tape and evidence markers. Monday morning, 3 days later, we got an email from corporate. Subject line: Important safety update. The company had implemented new security measures, they said. Badge access restrictions, emergency protocol reviews, additional training seminars. They expressed condolences for the tragic incident that occurred in our building complex. Not our building specifically, but the building complex, like it was weather that had passed through instead of a man with a gun hunting one of our co-workers. No mention of Jason by name. No acknowledgement that an employee of ours was the target, that 6 other people died because Douglas Brennan knew Jason worked on our floor. The email ended with information about counseling services and a reminder that the office would reopen Wednesday with grief counselors available in the first-floor lobby. Business continuity, they called it. Essential to maintain operations and support our clients during this difficult time. I never went back. Couldn't walk through those doors knowing what I knew. What we all knew, but what the company wouldn't admit. That Jason had reported Brennan 2 years earlier when they'd worked together at Huntington, something about contract irregularities and kickbacks. That Brennan blamed Jason for his termination. That he'd sent emails, made threats. That Jason had gone to our HR about it just 2 weeks before. That our company knew someone was hunting Jason and did nothing except suggest he park in a different section of the garage. Diane went back for 1 day, collected her things, and quit. Nathan lasted a week. Most of us scattered, found other jobs, other cities even. The company sent out quarterly safety newsletters for a while, reminding employees to report suspicious activity, to participate in active shooter drills, to remember that workplace safety was everyone's responsibility. They never mentioned February, never mentioned Jason. Like if they didn't acknowledge it, it somehow didn't happen in their building, to their employee, on their watch. Corporate life teaches you things they never mention in college, like how the real danger in an office isn't missing deadlines or botched presentations. It's the people who smile while they tear you apart piece by piece. 26 and fresh into my first legitimate job at an insurance company downtown, I figured the worst part would be the commute, or maybe the endless spreadsheets. My dad spent 30 years at a manufacturing plant before retiring. Always came home with stories about harmless pranks and the occasional shouting match that ended with beers after work. What I witnessed during my 4th month there was something else entirely. Something that still makes me check my food twice before taking a bite. The morning it happened started like any other, with that familiar buzz of keyboards and muted phone conversations. But by noon, everything we thought we knew about our coworkers had shifted into something darker. Veronica had been terrorizing that office for 7 years before I arrived, though terrorizing might be too strong a word for what she did, at least on paper. She was a senior analyst, not even management, but she carried herself like she had dirt on everyone from the janitor to the CEO. Walking past her desk felt like crossing a sniper's sight line. You never knew if today was the day she'd pick you as her target. She had mastered this particular brand of cruelty that left no evidence, no trail HR could follow. She'd praise your work while mentioning how impressed she was that someone from your background could adapt so quickly. Or she'd ask about your weekend plans right after discussing her ski trip to Aspen, knowing full well you were living paycheck to paycheck. The way she operated reminded me of those nature documentaries where the predator toys with its prey before the kill. Except Veronica never went for the kill. She preferred to keep her victims alive and suffering. That particular Monday started with Veronica targeting Bethany from accounting, a quiet woman who'd been with the company for 2 years and mostly kept to herself. Bethany had recently started wearing these bright scarves to work, beautiful handmade pieces that her sister sent from Guatemala, where she was doing humanitarian work. They were probably the most colorful things in our beige and gray office, little bursts of life that made Bethany stand out in a way she never had before. I was refilling my water bottle when I heard Veronica's voice carrying across the break room, that fake concerned tone she used right before she went for the jugular. She was asking Bethany about her scarf, running her fingers along the fabric, complimenting the craftsmanship while suggesting that such ethnic patterns were certainly bold choices for a conservative workplace. Then she pivoted, wondering aloud if Bethany was trying to distract from recent weight gain. How clever to draw the eye upward, though really, had she considered that the bright colors might be doing the opposite of what she intended? I watched Bethany's face crumble in real time, watched her fingers nervously touch the scarf that 5 minutes ago had made her feel beautiful, probably reminded her of her sister, gave her confidence. Veronica kept going, mentioning a weight loss program her friend had success with, pulling up before and after photos on her phone, insisting Bethany take down the number, all while maintaining that poisonous sweetness that made it impossible to call her out without looking like you were overreacting. Other people were in that break room, at least 4 of us, and we all just stood there, frozen, afraid to intervene because we knew we'd be next. Bethany mumbled something about needing to get back to her desk, and as she hurried past me, I saw tears streaming down her face. Veronica just smiled and stirred her coffee, satisfied, like a cat that had just torn apart a mouse for sport. That was Wednesday, and by Friday morning, Veronica would be on the floor of that same break room, gasping for air while her face swelled up like a balloon. Wednesday afternoon dragged on with this heavy tension you could practically taste in the recycled office air. Bethany didn't come back after lunch, sent an email about feeling sick, and we all knew exactly what kind of sick she meant. I kept replaying the break room scene in my head while trying to focus on insurance claims, but my mind kept drifting to all the times I'd witnessed similar attacks. There was Tom from IT who stopped wearing his vintage band shirts after Veronica suggested he was trying too hard to seem young and hip for someone balding at 34. There was Monica, who used to bring homemade Filipino food, until Veronica complained about the smell and started a whole discussion about professional courtesy in shared spaces. Each person dimmed a little after their encounter with Veronica, like she was slowly draining the color from our office one victim at a time. The worst part was how she'd act completely normal afterward, chatting about weekend plans or asking for recipe recommendations as if she hadn't just destroyed someone's confidence an hour earlier. I need to tell you about Friday morning because even now, months later, I can still see every detail like it's burned into my retinas. Veronica always ate lunch at exactly noon, had this whole ritual where she'd heat up her meal prep container, usually some trendy diet food she'd post on Instagram, arrange everything perfectly on her plate, and eat at the round table by the window. She kept her lunch in the same spot in the fridge every day, top shelf, left corner, with her initials written in purple Sharpie on the lid. That Friday, she grabbed her container like always, heated up what looked like quinoa salad with grilled chicken and pine nuts, and sat down with her phone propped up against her water bottle, probably scrolling through social media or reading those toxic productivity blogs she loved to quote. I was microwaving my sad frozen burrito when she took her first bite, and then her second, and then everything went sideways fast. First, she started coughing. Not like when you swallow wrong, but these deep, rattling coughs that made everyone in the break room turn around. Her hand went to her throat, and I saw her eyes go wide. Real fear replacing that usual smugness for the first time since I'd known her. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, crashing against the floor. And that's when I noticed her lips were already swelling, turning this unnatural shade of purple red. She tried to speak but only managed these horrible wheezing sounds, like air being forced through a straw that was getting smaller and smaller. Her face started changing shape right in front of us, her eyelids puffing up until she could barely see, hives spreading across her neck like someone was painting them on in real time. She fumbled for her purse, knocking her perfectly arranged lunch across the table, quinoa and chicken scattering everywhere, and that's when she collapsed, her knees just giving out like someone had cut her strings. The next few minutes were absolute chaos, the kind that makes time move both too fast and too slow simultaneously. Phil from sales was already on the phone with 911, his voice shaking as he tried to describe what was happening. while Gloria from HR dropped to her knees beside Veronica, asking if anyone knew if she had allergies, if she carried an EpiPen. Veronica was making these terrifying, gasping sounds, her whole body jerking with the effort to breathe, and her face had swollen so much she was almost unrecognizable. Someone found an EpiPen in her purse, thank God, and Gloria jabbed it into her thigh right through her dress pants, but it barely seemed to help. I stood there holding my half-heated burrito, unable to move, unable to look away from this woman who had terrorized us for years, now fighting for every breath. The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 6 or 7 minutes, and they worked on her with this urgent efficiency that made it clear how serious this was. They got her on a stretcher, oxygen mask over her swollen face, and rushed her out while we all stood there in stunned silence, the break room still smelling like microwaved quinoa and fear. After the ambulance left, we all just stood there staring at the mess on the floor, the overturned chair, her phone still propped against her water bottle with some influencer's perfect life frozen on the screen. Gloria was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, asking if anyone knew what Veronica was allergic to, and that's when the reality of what just happened started sinking in. Someone had put something in her food, something they knew would trigger this reaction, and we all knew it, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Security showed up about 20 minutes later, started asking questions, taking photos of the break room, bagging up what was left of her lunch, but the damage was already done. The cameras in the break room had been down for 3 weeks, something about a system upgrade that kept getting delayed, and everyone knew it. HR sent us all home early, told us to expect a call over the weekend, but that call never came, at least not the kind we were expecting. Monday morning arrived with an email from corporate, one of those carefully worded messages that said everything and nothing at the same time. Veronica was recovering, would be taking an extended medical leave, and the company was conducting a thorough investigation into what they called an unfortunate incident. They reminded us about food allergy awareness, announced new protocols for food storage in common areas, and stressed that tampering with anyone's food was not only against company policy, but also illegal. What they didn't mention was that Bethany had submitted her resignation Friday afternoon, effective immediately, about 2 hours after Veronica was taken away in that ambulance. They also didn't mention that the security footage from the hallway leading to the break room, the only cameras that were working, showed at least 15 people going in and out that morning, including Bethany, who had supposedly called in sick. The investigation went on for weeks, interviews with everyone, polygraph tests that were voluntary but didn't feel voluntary, and through it all, this suffocating cloud of suspicion that made every interaction feel loaded with hidden meaning. The office changed after that Friday, transformed into something unrecognizable, even though all the furniture stayed in the same places. People started eating at their desks exclusively, keeping their food in locked containers or mini fridges they bought themselves, treating the communal kitchen like it was contaminated. Conversations became purely transactional. Nobody wanted to risk saying something that might be taken the wrong way, might make them a target for whoever had done this to Veronica. The scariest part was how many people I heard whispering that while they didn't condone what happened, they understood it, and that terrified me more than the actual poisoning. We all knew Veronica had pushed someone past their breaking point, but the fact that someone in our office, someone who sat through meetings with us and made small talk by the printer, had deliberately tried to kill her, or at least seriously harm her, that knowledge sat in our stomachs like a stone. Tom from IT quit 2 weeks later, said he couldn't handle the atmosphere anymore, and Monica transferred to the branch across town, taking a pay cut just to get away from what our office had become. Veronica never came back to work, officially took early retirement with a generous settlement that came with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, or at least that's what we heard through the gossip network that somehow survived even in our new culture of silence. Bethany disappeared completely, her LinkedIn deleted, her social media accounts gone like she'd never existed at all, though sometimes I wonder if she's out there somewhere, finally free from Veronica's shadow but carrying the weight of what she might have done. The company brought in consultants, team-building experts, even a workplace therapist, but nothing could fix what had broken that Friday. I lasted another 3 months before I found a new job, and during my exit interview, when they asked why I was leaving, I just said I needed a change of scenery. What I didn't say was that every time I opened the office fridge, I thought about how easy it had been for someone to nearly kill a coworker, how we'd all watched Veronica torment people for years and done nothing, how in the end, we became the kind of workplace where attempted murder felt like justice to someone. Now I work from home, make my own lunch, and sometimes late at night I still think about that moment when Veronica's eyes went wide with fear, when she realized someone she'd pushed too far had pushed back in the worst possible way, and I wonder if she ever understood that she'd created the very monster that almost killed her. Everyone at the warehouse knew me as the guy who actually gave a damn about inventory accuracy. 26 candles on my last birthday cake, 4 years since college, and I was still scanning packages at Midwest Logistics, while my roommate from freshman year was already pulling 6 figures at some tech startup. But I had a plan, and that Tuesday in early November was supposed to be when everything changed. My supervisor Craig had been dangling this operations coordinator position for months, dropping hints during smoke breaks, telling me to be patient, that good things come to those who wait. When he finally called me into his office that afternoon, right after the lunch trucks finished loading, I thought my persistence had paid off. Craig's office sat in the corner of the warehouse, one of those prefab structures with thin walls and a window overlooking the loading docks. He had this habit of keeping the blinds half closed, creating these weird shadows across his desk that made everything feel like a confession booth. I remember knocking twice, hearing his voice call me in, and finding him leaning back in his chair with his feet up on the desk, work boots still caked with yesterday's mud. He smiled when he saw me, but it was different from his usual grin, the kind he'd flash when telling dirty jokes by the forklift. This smile stayed too long on his face, like he was savoring something before swallowing it. "Close the door behind you, champ," he said, and I did. Even though we usually kept doors open during one-on-ones, company policy about transparency and all that. The conversation started normal enough, Craig asking about my weekend, whether I caught the game Sunday night, regular boss small talk that usually meant he was warming up to something bigger. I sat in the metal folding chair across from his desk, the one with the uneven leg that rocked if you shifted your weight, and waited for him to get to the point about the coordinator position. He talked about the company's growth, how corporate was impressed with our numbers, how he needed someone he could trust in a management role. Then he stood up, walked around the desk, and sat on its edge, right in front of me, close enough that I could smell the Copenhagen on his breath. "You want this promotion, right?" he asked. And when I nodded, probably too eagerly, he continued, "Good, because I've been watching you, and I think you understand what loyalty means around here." At first I thought he meant staying late without overtime complaints, covering shifts when people called in sick, the usual workplace dedication speech every boss gives before adding more to your plate. But Craig kept going, explaining how loyalty meant understanding that some conversations never leave his office, that good employees know when to speak up and when to stay quiet, that gratitude wasn't just saying thank you, but showing it in ways that mattered. His hand landed on my shoulder while he talked, heavy and warm through my polo shirt, and he squeezed just hard enough to make his point without leaving marks. "The thing about opportunities," he said, leaning closer, "is they come with expectations, and I need to know you're mature enough to handle those expectations without making things complicated." The fluorescent light above us hummed and flickered, casting his face in and out of shadow, and I noticed for the first time that he'd locked the door after I closed it. I tried to lean back in the wobbly chair, create some distance, but there was nowhere to go, just Craig's presence filling the small office like smoke from a fire you can't locate. He started talking about other employees who disappointed him, people who'd confused professional boundaries with personal attacks, who didn't understand that success required sacrifice and flexibility. His examples got more specific, mentioning Amy from receiving who'd filed a complaint last year before suddenly transferring to the night shift, then quitting altogether. She didn't understand the game, he said, his fingers drumming against the desk beside my arm, each tap deliberate and measured. But you're smarter than that, aren't you? You've been here long enough to know how things really work, how sometimes you need to trust your supervisor's judgment, even when it doesn't make complete sense at first. The promotion paperwork was right there on his desk. I could see my name typed on the top form. The salary increase that would finally let me move out of my studio apartment, maybe even start paying down those student loans faster. Craig followed my eyes to the papers and grinned wider, picking up the stack and fanning them out like a poker hand. $48,000 a year, he said, plus benefits, plus my personal mentorship, which is worth more than money if you're smart enough to appreciate it. He put the papers in his desk drawer, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then he pulled out his personal phone, not the company one, and asked for my number, said he preferred texting for urgent matters. That email left too much of a paper trail for efficient communication. When I hesitated, his expression shifted, not angry exactly, but disappointed, like a teacher catching a promising student cheating on a test. Trust, he said slowly, is a two-way street, and right now you're standing at a crossroads. I gave him my number, watched him type it into his phone with thick fingers that seemed to take forever hitting each digit, and immediately felt my own phone buzz in my pocket. His first text was already there. Good choice. He told me the promotion would be official by Friday, but there were some training sessions he wanted to handle personally, after hours, to make sure I was ready for the responsibility. The way he said after hours made my chest tighten, but I nodded, told myself this was just how advancement worked, that everyone had to pay their dues somehow. Craig stood up, finally giving me room to breathe, and walked to the door, unlocking it with a casual motion like the last 20 minutes had been a normal performance review. "Oh, one more thing," he said, turning back to face me. "This conversation stays between us, understood? Corporate doesn't need to know every detail about how I develop my team, and neither does anyone else in the warehouse. Discretion is the first lesson in management." That night, the texts started coming around 10:30, just as I was getting ready for bed. First one was innocent enough, asking if I could come in an hour early tomorrow to review some paperwork. Then another at 11, reminding me to wear something presentable for our morning meeting. By midnight, he'd sent 4 more messages, each one slightly more personal than the last, asking about my living situation, whether I had a girlfriend, if I ever felt lonely working so much. I didn't respond to any of them, just lay there staring at my phone screen lighting up in the dark, each buzz making my apartment feel smaller and smaller. The last text came at 1:15 in the morning, just 2 words that made sleep impossible. "You awake?" I turned off my phone completely, something I never did in case of family emergencies, and spent the rest of the night listening to every sound in my building, wondering if that was a car door slamming or just my neighbor coming home late. Wednesday morning came too fast and not fast enough. That weird paradox of dreading something while desperately wanting it to be over. I arrived at my usual time, not the hour early Craig had requested, and found my schedule completely rearranged on the assignment board. Instead of my regular receiving duties, I was assigned to solo inventory in the back warehouse, the section we called the dungeon because of its broken lights and distance from everyone else. Craig was waiting there when I arrived, leaning against a stack of pallets with a clipboard, acting like it was perfectly normal for a supervisor to personally oversee routine inventory counts. "Sleep well?" he asked, and the way he emphasized the word sleep made it clear he knew exactly when I'd turned off my phone. For the next 3 hours, he shadowed me through the aisles, never quite touching, but always close enough that I could feel his presence, asking questions about my counting methods, my organizational preferences, whether I preferred working alone or with a partner. The pattern established itself over the next 2 weeks like a noose tightening one twist at a time. If I didn't respond to his late-night texts fast enough, my schedule would mysteriously change, putting me on the loading dock during the coldest hours or assigning me to clean the break room during my usual lunch period. When I did respond, keeping things professional and brief, he'd find reasons to call me into his office, each meeting a little longer than the last, each conversation pushing boundaries a little further. He started sharing details about his divorce, his custody battle, how lonely leadership could be, always punctuating these confessions with comments about trust and loyalty and understanding. Other employees began avoiding me, not obviously, but in that way people distanced themselves from someone marked by authority's attention. Even Larry, who'd trained me 4 years ago and usually had a joke for everything, stopped making eye contact when we passed in the aisles. By the 3rd week, I was surviving on 3 hours of sleep a night, jumping at every notification sound, screening calls from numbers I didn't recognize because Craig had started calling from different phones when I didn't answer his personal cell. My work performance tanked, simple inventory counts taking twice as long because I couldn't focus, couldn't stop checking exits, couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching even when his office door was closed. The promotion paperwork never materialized, of course, though Craig kept mentioning it was in process whenever I tried to bring it up. Instead, he started suggesting we discuss my future over drinks after work, maybe dinner on Saturday to really dive deep into career planning. When I declined, citing a family obligation that didn't exist, he assigned me to work that exact Saturday. Over time, I couldn't afford to refuse given my student loan payment was due. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in December when I finally went to HR, sitting across from Linda in her clean, organized office that felt like a different universe from Craig's cave. I told her everything, showed her the texts on my phone, explained the schedule changes, the isolation, the constant surveillance disguised as mentorship. She took notes, nodded sympathetically, asked if I'd explicitly told Craig to stop contacting me outside of work hours. When I said no, not in those exact words, her expression shifted slightly, professionally neutral but somehow dismissive. She explained that Craig's communication style might be unconventional, but without explicit harassment or discrimination, it fell into a gray area of management discretion. The texts I showed her were gone when I looked again during our meeting, somehow deleted from my phone even though I knew I hadn't touched them. Linda suggested I document everything going forward, maintain professional boundaries, and come back if anything concrete happened. Craig knew about my HR visit before I even made it back to the warehouse floor. I could see it in his face when he passed me near the loading dock, that particular smile that meant he was 3 steps ahead and enjoying the view. That night, no texts came, no calls, nothing but silence that felt louder than all his previous messages combined. The next morning, I found myself assigned to work with a crew transferring to our satellite facility 40 miles away, a temporary assignment that would last indefinitely according to the schedule. My access card stopped working for the main office area. IT said it was a system glitch they'd fix eventually. The promotion posting disappeared from the internal job board, and when I asked about it, I was told the position had been eliminated due to restructuring. Coworkers who'd previously just avoided me now looked at me with something between pity and relief. Like I was a cautionary tale they were grateful not to be living. I quit 2 weeks later, walking out in the middle of a shift because I couldn't stand another day of exile, another night of wondering when the silence would break, another morning of checking my phone for messages that never came but somehow still controlled my entire existence. No reference, no unemployment eligibility, just gone with 4 years of my life reduced to a gap on my resume I still struggle to explain in interviews. 6 months later, I heard through a former coworker that Craig had promoted someone new to operations coordinator, a young guy fresh from college who apparently understood the importance of loyalty and gratitude. They said Craig keeps a photo from the kids' promotion ceremony on his desk, right where anyone sitting in that wobbly metal chair would have to see it. Sometimes I still wake up at 1:15 in the morning, phone in hand before I'm fully conscious, checking for messages that aren't there from a number I blocked but memorized, waiting for a conversation that ended but never really stopped. Insurance adjusting isn't glamorous work, but after graduating college in 2011, I needed something stable, while everyone else was still recovering from the recession. Our office in downtown Portland only had 12 employees, tucked into the 4th floor of a building that used to house a department store in the 70s. Most mornings, I'd arrive around 8:30, grab coffee from the break room that always smelled faintly of burnt popcorn, and settle into my cubicle near the window. It was predictable, comfortable even, the kind of job where you knew everyone's lunch orders and whose kid had soccer practice on Wednesdays. That February morning when Harold started, I remember thinking how exhausted he looked, like someone had drained all the color from his face and forgotten to put it back. Harold took the empty desk 3 cubicles down from mine, the one that had been vacant since Carolyn retired. During his first week, he kept entirely to himself, eating lunch at his desk while staring at his computer screen, never joining our Friday afternoon conversations about weekend plans. I noticed him because of how deliberately unnoticeable he tried to be, if that makes sense. He wore the same style of gray polo shirt every day, just in different shades, and moved through the office like he was afraid of taking up too much space. About 2 weeks in, I found him in the break room during lunch, heating up a single serving of instant soup, and something about the way he stood there watching the microwave timer count down made my chest tight with recognition. I knew that posture, that hollow look. My brother had worn it for months after his own marriage fell apart. Maybe that's why I started bringing extra portions of dinner leftovers, casually mentioning I'd made too much pasta, or that my slow cooker recipes always served 6, even though I lived alone. Harold would hesitate at first, his fingers drumming against his desk before accepting, always insisting he'd bring something next time to make it even. He never did, but I didn't mind. We started eating together in the break room, and gradually he began sharing fragments of his story. His ex-wife had kept the house in Beaverton. Their daughter visited every other weekend, and he was renting a studio apartment near the river that got terrible water pressure, but had a nice view of the bridge. Normal divorce stuff, painful but manageable, the kind of life readjustment thousands of people navigate every year. By April, our lunch routine had evolved into something comfortable. Harold would wait for me by the elevator at noon, holding the door even when I was running late from a phone call. He started contributing to conversations, offering surprisingly funny observations about our coworkers' habits, like how Martin always cleared his throat exactly 3 times before answering his phone, or how Sheila rearranged her desk plants based on her mood. I genuinely enjoyed his company. When he mentioned he'd never tried the Mediterranean place 2 blocks over, I suggested we walk there on Friday, and his face lit up like I'd offered him a winning lottery ticket. That should have registered as unusual, that intensity of reaction. But loneliness can make people grateful for small kindnesses. I understood that, or thought I did. The text messages started innocently enough. Harold had asked for my number after I'd offered to send him a recipe for the lemon chicken I'd brought one day, and initially his messages were sparse, appropriate. A thank you for lunch, a joke about something that happened in the office, a picture of his attempt at the recipe that had turned out surprisingly well. But by early May, I was waking up to multiple messages every morning. Photos of his breakfast with comments about what I might be eating, observations about the weather and whether I'd dressed warm enough, links to articles about topics I'd mentioned once in passing weeks ago. He'd apparently cataloged every casual comment I'd made. When I mentioned liking jazz during one lunch conversation, I received daily YouTube links to obscure jazz recordings at exactly 6 a.m., each with a lengthy paragraph about why this particular piece reminded him of something I'd said or done. One Monday in mid-May, I decided to eat lunch at my desk to catch up on paperwork, sending Harold a quick text that I couldn't make our usual break room meeting. Within 3 minutes, he was standing at my cubicle, holding 2 sandwiches from the deli downstairs, insisting he'd bought too much by accident. When I explained I really needed to focus on work, his jaw tightened in this peculiar way, like he was physically holding words inside his mouth. He set the sandwich on my desk anyway, then pulled up a chair from an empty cubicle and sat there eating his lunch while I worked, occasionally commenting on my typing speed or asking about the claim I was reviewing. Every time I glanced up, he was watching me, not eating, just watching with this slight smile that made my scalp prickle. After that day, eating lunch alone became impossible. He'd always appear with food, acting like we'd planned it. I started leaving the office for lunch, telling everyone I had errands to run or appointments to keep. Harold would text asking where I was, if everything was okay, if he'd done something wrong. 15, 20 messages in an hour. When I returned, he'd be waiting by my desk with this wounded expression, asking why I hadn't responded. Didn't I see his messages? I tried being direct but gentle, explaining that I needed some space, that friendship required boundaries. He nodded along, apologizing profusely, promising to dial it back. The next morning, there were 36 roses on my desk with a card that read, "For being such a patient friend," and my coworkers were all smiling and making assumptions that made me want to crawl under my desk. When I told Harold the roses were inappropriate, he looked genuinely confused, insisted they were just a friendly gesture, that I was reading too much into it. Martin overheard and joked that I should be flattered, and Harold latched onto that immediately, repeating it whenever I tried to establish distance. The breaking point came on a Saturday in early June. I was at the farmer's market with my sister when I spotted Harold 3 stalls behind us, poorly hidden behind a display of hanging plants. When we moved to the next vendor, he followed. When we stopped for coffee, he sat 2 tables away with a newspaper held up to his face like some cartoon detective. My sister noticed him too, asked if that was the coworker I'd mentioned had been getting clingy. Clingy didn't begin to cover it anymore. I confronted him right there, walked straight to his table while my sister filmed on her phone just in case. Harold's face crumpled like a child caught stealing candy. He swore it was a coincidence, that he came to this market every Saturday, had been coming for years, but when I asked him to name a single vendor or what he'd bought, he just stared at me with those pale gray eyes getting wet around the edges, then stood up and walked away without another word. I thought that public embarrassment might have finally gotten through to him. Monday at work, Harold wasn't at his desk. Neither was his computer, his coffee mug, the small cactus he kept by his monitor. For one beautiful moment, I thought he'd quit, maybe realized he'd crossed too many lines. But then I found out from Sheila that he'd requested to move to the 3rd floor, told management he needed a quieter workspace to focus better. The relief I felt was physical, like someone had removed a weight from my chest. For 2 weeks, everything felt normal again. I could eat lunch in peace, check my phone without finding dozens of messages, walk to my car after work without constantly scanning the parking lot. I even started staying late again to catch up on the backlog I'd accumulated while trying to avoid Harold. That false sense of security was exactly what he was counting on, I realize now. The notes started appearing on my car in late June, tucked under the windshield wiper like parking tickets. The first one was just a single line, "I miss our lunches." No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, that cramped, precise script I'd seen on countless forms. I threw it away, didn't mention it to anyone. The next day there was another. "You looked nice in the blue dress yesterday." I hadn't seen Harold at all that day, hadn't even known he was watching. They escalated quickly after that. Details about what I'd eaten for dinner, visible through my apartment window. Comments about the TV shows I watched, the glow apparently visible from the street. Observations about my morning routine, what time I turned on the bathroom light, how long my showers lasted. I filed a report with building security, but they said without proof it was Harold, without any explicit threats. There wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the garage. The police said essentially the same thing when I went to them with a folder full of the notes. Then my mother started getting Facebook friend requests from someone claiming to be my boyfriend, using photos stolen from my Instagram, but with Harold's face poorly photoshopped over whoever I'd been standing next to. My cousin received LinkedIn messages about what a wonderful couple Harold and I made, how we were planning to move in together soon. My landlord called asking about my fiancé who'd stopped by to look at adding his name to the lease, describing Harold perfectly, even though I'd never once brought him to my apartment building. I changed my locks, installed a doorbell camera, started parking in different spots each day. I documented everything, built a case file that would make any detective proud. HR at work said they'd spoken to Harold about maintaining professional boundaries, but since nothing was happening on company property anymore, their hands were tied. I was drowning in bureaucracy while Harold was systematically inserting himself into every corner of my life, and everyone around me seemed to think I was overreacting to someone who was just lonely or probably harmless. The night everything unraveled was a Wednesday in July, one of those humid Portland evenings where the air feels too thick to breathe properly. I'd stayed late at the office finishing a complex claim, the building mostly empty except for the cleaning crew. Around 9:30, I finally packed up and headed to the parking garage, my keys between my fingers like I'd been doing for weeks. My car was the only one left on level 2 besides a maintenance van, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars. As I approached my car, I noticed something off about my driver's side door. It was unlocked, slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered the click of the locks when I'd left that morning. My phone was already in my hand, 911 pre-dialed, when I heard footsteps echoing from the stairwell. Not running, just walking steadily, purposefully. I ran to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors just as Harold emerged from the shadows, carrying a box of my things from my desk. Items I hadn't even noticed were missing. He stood there in the harsh garage lighting, looking confused and hurt, like I was the one behaving strangely. I called 911 right there, windows up, doors locked, while Harold stood 5 feet away from my car holding that box like some demented delivery man. He kept talking, though I couldn't hear the words through the glass, his mouth moving frantically. His free hand gesturing at the box, at me, at himself. The police arrived within 10 minutes that felt like hours, and Harold actually smiled when he saw them, like they'd come to mediate a simple misunderstanding. While the officers separated us for questioning, one of them went back into the building with security to review the footage from the past week. What they found made even the veteran cop's face go pale. Harold had been entering the building almost every night using a copied key card, sitting at my desk for hours in the dark, going through my drawers, my computer, even eating the snacks I kept in my bottom drawer. The footage from just 3 hours earlier showed him at my desk, while I was in the conference room down the hall, completely unaware. He'd been doing this for weeks, maybe longer, living some twisted fantasy where my workspace was his, where my life was his to examine and document. They arrested Harold that night for breaking and entering, trespassing, and theft. During the investigation, they found journals at his apartment filled with detailed logs of my daily activities, printed screenshots of every social media post I'd ever made, photos of me taken from distances with a telephoto lens, and worst of all, a wedding planning book where he'd pasted my face next to his in various venue brochures. He'd already put deposits down at 2 locations for the following spring. The restraining order went through immediately, and Harold was terminated from the company the next day. He pled guilty to avoid trial, got 18 months probation and mandatory counseling. I never went back to that office. I couldn't sit at that desk knowing he'd been there in the darkness, touching my things, breathing in my space, pretending we shared something that existed only in his fractured mind. I moved to a different neighborhood, changed jobs, deleted most of my social media. 6 months later, I heard through a former coworker that Harold had moved to Idaho to live with his elderly parents. I still check my rearview mirror too often. Still feel my chest tighten when I see gray polo shirts. Still triple check my locks before bed. Some violations of trust leave marks that don't fade. They just become part of your routine, woven into the fabric of how you move through the world. I started the engine and drove straight to the police station. Harold's figure shrinking in my rearview mirror, still standing in that same spot holding that box. The officers took my statement, said they'd increase patrols around my apartment, suggested a restraining order. But what happened next changed everything. The next morning, our head of security, Walter, pulled me aside with his laptop, his face pale and serious. He'd been reviewing footage from the past month after my parking garage incident, going through the overnight recordings that normally nobody checked. What he showed me made my entire body go cold. There was Harold, using a key card to enter the building at 2, 3 in the morning, multiple times a week. The cameras showed him going to the 4th floor, to our old department. He'd sit at my desk for hours in the complete darkness, just sitting in my chair, going through my drawers, typing on my keyboard, even though the computer was off. In one recording from just 3 nights ago, he'd brought a blanket and pillow, sleeping under my desk until 5 a.m. before leaving through the stairwell. Walter had checked the keycard logs. Harold had reported his card stolen weeks ago and gotten a replacement, but had clearly kept the original and been using it for his midnight visits. The police arrested Harold that afternoon at his apartment, where they found notebooks filled with detailed logs of my daily activities, hundreds of photos of me taken without my knowledge, and most disturbingly, a set of keys they matched to my apartment, copies he'd somehow had made, though thankfully my recent lock change had rendered them useless. He'd been entering the office for 6 weeks, they determined, starting right after he'd moved to the 3rd floor. The security footage also revealed he'd installed something under my desk, a tiny recording device that picked up my phone conversations, which explained how he knew so much about my schedule and personal life. Harold was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and unlawful surveillance. He took a plea deal for 2 years in prison and a permanent restraining order. I never went back to that office. The company transferred me to their Seattle branch with a small settlement to avoid any liability issues, and I started fresh in a new city. That was 3 years ago. I still check my rearview mirror too often. Still feel my chest tighten when I see someone in a gray polo shirt. Still can't shake the image of him sleeping under my desk, curled up in the exact spot where my feet would go, like he was trying to exist in the negative space of my life. April has always been my favorite month in Seattle, when the rain finally starts to let up, and you can actually see Mount Rainier from the office windows. I'd been working at Holloway Architecture for about 18 months, long enough to know everyone's coffee order and which printer would jam if you looked at it wrong. We were a small firm, just 12 of us crammed into the 7th floor of a converted warehouse downtown, the kind of place where everyone wore multiple hats, and the holiday party was just ordering Thai food and drinking wine from coffee mugs. Most days felt like working with an extended family, which made what happened next feel like such a profound betrayal that even now, 2 years later, I still check every smoke detector in every room I enter. It was Charlotte who found it first, though she didn't realize what she was looking at initially. She'd been standing on the toilet seat trying to open the bathroom window that had been painted shut since probably the Clinton administration, when she noticed the smoke detector above the stalls looked different from the one in the hallway. The LED light that should have been green was red, and there was this tiny black circle in the center that definitely wasn't there on the other detectors. She mentioned it to me during lunch, more curious than concerned, wondering if maybe building maintenance had upgraded just that one for some reason. But something about it nagged at me all afternoon, that little detail scratching at the back of my mind like a song you can't quite remember. Around 3 that afternoon, I couldn't focus on the residential plans spread across my desk anymore. I told myself I was being ridiculous as I walked to the women's bathroom, but I locked the door behind me anyway. Standing on the same toilet seat Charlotte had used, I got my first close look at that smoke detector. My stomach did this weird flip when I saw it properly, because that black circle wasn't just different, it was a camera lens. I actually laughed at first, this nervous, disbelieving sound that echoed off the tile walls, because things like this happened in news stories about gas stations or sketchy motels, not in your own office where you knew everyone by their kids' names and their favorite basketball teams. I climbed down and sat right there on the bathroom floor for a minute, trying to process what this meant. The detector had been there since before I started. I was sure of it, which meant someone had been recording every woman in our office for God knows how long. Every time we'd adjusted our clothes, fixed our makeup, had private phone conversations during rough days, changed after cycling to work in the morning, someone had been watching. The violation of it hit me in waves, each realization worse than the last, and I had to grip the edge of the sink to stop myself from either screaming or throwing up. Charlotte was still at her desk when I practically dragged her into the conference room, my voice shaking as I told her what I'd found. Her face went through this progression of expressions, from confusion to disbelief to a kind of horror that made her whole body seem to shrink into itself. We called in Priya, our office manager, and watched her normally composed demeanor completely crumble as she processed what we were telling her. Within an hour, all 5 women in the office were huddled in that conference room, speaking in hushed voices like we were afraid the walls might be listening too. The men were still working at their desks, oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off in our professional lives. Priya said we needed to call the police immediately, but first she wanted to document everything. She put on latex gloves from the first aid kit, stood on a chair she'd brought from the conference room, and carefully unscrewed the fake smoke detector. The thing came away from the ceiling easily, too easily, with just a battery pack attached to the back and a small memory card tucked into a slot on the side. Looking at it sitting there on the conference table, this cheap piece of hardware that you could probably buy online for $30 made everything feel surreal and impossibly sorted at the same time. We could see the real smoke detector underneath where the fake had been mounted, painted over like it had been covered for years. The police arrived within the hour, 2 officers who seemed almost as uncomfortable as we were. They bagged the device as evidence and took statements from each of us separately, asking when we'd first noticed anything unusual, who had access to the bathroom, whether we'd seen anyone acting suspiciously. The younger officer, a woman who couldn't have been more than 25, kept apologizing like she was personally responsible for what had happened to us. While they were processing the scene, Walter, our senior partner, finally noticed the commotion and came over to ask what was going on. I'll never forget the way his face changed when Priya explained, this slow-motion collapse from confusion to shock, to something that looked almost like panic. By 5:30, everyone knew. The men in the office stood around in awkward clusters, not making eye contact with any of us, like they'd all been collectively accused of something. Walter called an emergency meeting, his voice cracking as he promised a full investigation. Said he'd already called our building management and our IT contractor to check if anyone had requested access to that bathroom recently. He kept running his hand through what was left of his gray hair, repeating that in 30 years of running this firm, nothing like this had ever happened. But here's what made my skin crawl. Every single man in that room had a key card that could access the women's bathroom after hours for maintenance or emergencies, a detail I'd never thought twice about until that moment. The forensics tech who came the next day was this methodical woman who spent 3 hours examining the memory card while we all pretended to work. She told us the footage went back 14 months, with motion-activated recordings that captured everything during business hours. 14 months of private moments, stored on a card smaller than a quarter. She said whoever did this had been downloading the footage regularly, probably monthly, replacing the batteries at the same time. The level of planning made me physically ill. The idea that someone had marked their calendar for their monthly violation ritual, probably stayed late on a Friday or came in on a weekend when no one would notice. Charlotte quit that same week, didn't even work out her 2 weeks' notice, just packed her desk and left. I couldn't blame her. The rest of us tried to maintain some normalcy, but it was impossible. Every conversation felt loaded, every interaction suspect. We started using the bathroom on the 3rd floor, taking the stairs just to avoid running into the men from our office in the elevator. Priya installed a new lock on the women's bathroom that required a special code only the 5 of us knew, but it felt like putting a band-aid on a severed artery. The damage was already done, the trust completely shattered, and we all knew one of the 7 men we worked with every day had done this to us. HR brought in a specialist from some consulting firm, a woman in an expensive suit, who conducted individual interviews with everyone, asking probing questions about office dynamics and whether we'd noticed any inappropriate behavior. She set up a tip line, promised complete anonymity, talked about implementing new security protocols and mandatory training sessions. Walter sent out daily emails about the investigation's progress, which was basically no progress at all. The police said without DNA evidence or fingerprints, which the person had been careful not to leave, and without any distinguishing features in the footage that could identify who installed it, they had very little to go on. The memory card was a generic brand sold everywhere, the device ordered online with no way to trace the buyer. 3 weeks passed in this suffocating limbo. We'd get updates that led nowhere, promises that something would be done, assurances that they were taking this seriously, but every day we had to walk into that office, sit across from our male colleagues in meetings, pretend to collaborate on projects while wondering which one had watched us in our most vulnerable moments. I started having dreams about it, would wake up at 3 in the morning convinced I could feel eyes on me even in my own apartment. The worst part was how normal everyone acted, how they all expressed the right amount of outrage and sympathy, every single one of them playing the part of the shocked and supportive colleague perfectly. Then came the Monday morning that changed everything. I arrived early, around 7, hoping to get some work done before everyone else showed up and the pretense of normalcy began. The office was quiet, just the hum of computers that never got turned off, and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I went to make coffee in the kitchen, and when I came back to my desk, Priya was standing in the hallway outside the women's bathroom, her face pale as printer paper. She had her phone in one hand and was gesturing frantically with the other for me to come over. My coffee mug slipped from my hand when I saw what she was looking at. Brown liquid spreading across the carpet in a pattern I'd still see weeks later every time I closed my eyes. There was a new smoke detector installed above the toilet. Same spot, same angle. But this one was white instead of beige, with a tiny green LED that blinked every few seconds like it was winking at us. The original fake one was still in police evidence. The real one was still painted over on the ceiling, which meant someone had brought in a third device and installed it over the weekend. Someone who still had access to the building, who knew the investigation had stalled, who was confident enough or desperate enough to do it again. Priya's hands shook as she called Walter, then the police, then started taking photos from every angle. I just stood there frozen, because this meant the person wasn't some outside contractor or former employee like we'd been hoping. They were still here, still watching, and they wanted us to know they weren't going to stop. The police arrived faster this time, and they weren't playing around. They sealed off the entire floor, brought in a forensics team that dusted every surface for prints, pulled security footage from the building's cameras. The detective, a tired-looking man named Ramirez who'd been handling our case, stood in Walter's office with his arms crossed, explaining that whoever did this had used the emergency stairwell to avoid the main cameras, but there should be key card data showing who accessed the building over the weekend. Walter's assistant pulled the records while we all waited in the conference room, the 7 men separated from us women like we were opposing teams in some horrible game. The key card data showed that 4 people had been in the building over the weekend. Walter himself on Saturday morning, saying he'd come to catch up on emails. Our IT guy, Paul, on Saturday afternoon for scheduled server maintenance. Junior architect Colin on Sunday evening to grab files he'd forgotten. And surprisingly, Richard, our 60-year-old structural engineer who said he'd been meeting a client. Each of them had perfectly reasonable explanations, documentation to back up their stories, alibis that couldn't quite be verified but couldn't be disproven either. The security footage was useless, showing nothing but empty hallways and closed doors, the stairwell cameras conveniently experiencing a glitch during the crucial hours. It was like watching someone play chess when you could only see half the board, knowing they were making moves you couldn't track. That afternoon, Walter made an executive decision. He sent all the women home with full pay, said we could work remotely while they sorted this out, installed new security cameras in every hallway and common area. The men would continue coming to the office, he said, where they'd be under constant surveillance. He hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage cases. She interviewed each of the weekend visitors multiple times, pushing for inconsistencies, checking their devices, examining their home computers with signed consent that they couldn't refuse without looking guilty. Paul broke first, not because he was guilty, but because the stress gave him a panic attack so severe they had to call an ambulance. Colin threatened to sue for harassment. Richard just sat there during each interview with this eerily calm expression, answering every question in measured tones. The breakthrough came from the last place anyone expected. The building's cleaning lady, Maria, who came in Sunday nights, reached out to Priya after hearing about the investigation. She said she'd seen something odd weeks before the first camera was discovered. Richard in the office at midnight on a Sunday, which she remembered because she'd had to clean around him, and he'd been irritated about it. She'd seen him carrying a small ladder from the supply closet, claimed he was checking the air conditioning vents for a draft complaint. The security footage from that night had been automatically deleted after 30 days, long before anyone knew to look for it. When confronted with this, Richard didn't deny it, didn't make excuses, just smiled this small, satisfied smile, and asked for his lawyer. They found videos on his home computer, hundreds of hours organized by date and person, each file meticulously labeled. He'd been selling the footage online, running a sick little business out of our trauma. He got 8 years, lost his engineering license, his pension, everything. But even now, when I use any bathroom that isn't in my own home, I look up at the ceiling first, checking for little black circles in things that shouldn't have them, knowing that somewhere out there, strangers might still be watching videos of the most private moments of my life. Six months into my job as a compliance officer at Riverside Private Hospital, everything changed on what started as a routine Monday morning. Fresh from my master's program and eager to prove myself, I'd been assigned to review billing discrepancies that everyone assumed were simple clerical errors. The hospital treated celebrities and wealthy families from across the state, and my supervisor had made it clear that accuracy was paramount for maintaining our reputation. My cramped office on the 3rd floor had become my second home, surrounded by stacks of files and dual monitors displaying endless spreadsheets. Most people my age were out partying on weekends while I was cross-referencing insurance claims with treatment records, determined to make a good impression at my first real job. That morning, coffee in hand, I noticed something strange in the cardiac unit's billing from the previous quarter. A patient named George Whitman had supposedly undergone 3 separate angioplasties in a single week, each billed at $47,000. When I pulled his treatment logs from our medical database, only one procedure appeared, performed by Dr. Chen on a Wednesday afternoon. I checked another file, then another, and my pulse quickened as a pattern emerged. Dozens of patients showed multiple expensive procedures in billing that didn't exist in the actual medical records. Some patients had been discharged days before their supposed surgeries. Others had never even been admitted to the units where these procedures allegedly took place. By noon, I documented over 200 fraudulent claims totaling nearly $8 million. The fake entries followed a sophisticated pattern, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic insurance review. Someone had created phantom patient IDs that existed only in the billing system, complete with fake social security numbers and addresses that led to vacant lots or abandoned buildings. Each fraudulent claim was approved by the same sequence of administrators, their digital signatures appearing on documents for procedures that never happened. The money trail disappeared into a maze of department budgets and external vendor payments that would take weeks to fully untangle. I printed everything, my heart racing as page after page confirmed what I was seeing wasn't a mistake, but deliberate, systematic fraud. I spent the rest of that afternoon triple-checking my findings, creating backup files on my personal laptop and a flash drive I kept in my purse. The scope of this was beyond anything I'd imagined when I took this job. Whoever orchestrated this understood our system's blind spots perfectly, exploiting the gap between medical records and billing that existed because the two databases didn't automatically sync. They knew exactly how long they had before monthly reconciliation reports were generated, and they'd been careful to spread the fraud across different departments to avoid detection. My supervisor, Michael Thornton, was out of town until tomorrow, so I decided to compile everything into a comprehensive report that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Around 7 that evening, alone in the office with only the emergency lighting in the hallways, I heard footsteps approaching my door. Dr. Harrison, our chief medical officer, appeared in my doorway wearing his golf clothes instead of his usual suit. He rarely stayed past 4, and I'd never seen him on this floor before. He glanced at the papers spread across my desk, then at my computer screen still displaying billing records, and asked what was keeping me so late. His voice was casual, but his eyes moved quickly across my workspace, taking in every detail. I told him I was working on routine audits, trying to keep my voice steady while discreetly closing my laptop. He nodded slowly, mentioned something about dedication being admirable in young employees, then suggested I should head home and get some rest. After he left, I waited 10 minutes before gathering everything and leaving through the back stairwell. The next morning, Michael Thornton was already in his office when I arrived at 8, even though his assistant had said he wouldn't be back until afternoon. He called me in immediately, closing the door with a deliberate click that made my stomach tighten. His usually friendly demeanor was replaced by something I couldn't quite read as he gestured for me to sit in the chair facing his desk. The blinds were drawn, unusual for him, casting the room in a dim yellow glow from his desk lamp. He asked me about my audit findings, specifically mentioning the cardiac unit, which I hadn't told anyone about yet. When I started to explain what I'd discovered, he held up his hand and pulled out a thick folder from his drawer. Inside was my employment contract, with the non-disclosure agreement highlighted in yellow, along with printed screenshots of my computer activity from yesterday. Michael leaned back in his chair and explained, in a tone like he was discussing the weather, that Riverside had certain financial arrangements that kept the hospital running and able to provide excellent care. These arrangements, he continued, were approved at the highest levels, including by our biggest donor, James Fitzgerald, who also happened to chair the board of directors. The fraudulent billing I'd discovered wasn't fraud at all, he insisted, but a complex financial structure designed to offset operational costs that insurance companies refuse to cover. He showed me a document with my digital signature, supposedly authorizing these transactions, though I'd never seen it before. The timestamp showed it was created yesterday evening, after I'd left the office. He said I had 2 choices: continue my work focusing on other departments and receive a substantial raise, or persist with this investigation and face legal action for violating my NDA and potentially embezzling funds myself, given my signature on these documents. I sat there, feeling the walls of that office press closer as he outlined how my career would end before it started if I didn't cooperate. He mentioned that young professionals sometimes misunderstood complex healthcare financing, that my student loans of $70,000 must be a burden, and that Riverside valued employees who showed discretion. The raise he offered was more than double my current salary, enough to pay off my loans in 2 years instead of 10. All I had to do was delete my files, forget what I'd seen, and focus on other areas of compliance. He gave me until the end of the day to decide, though we both knew there was only one answer he'd accept. As I stood to leave, he added that Fitzgerald's influence extended far beyond Riverside, that every hospital in the state relied on his donations, and that making an enemy of him would ensure I'd never work in healthcare again. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, mechanically going through motions while my mind raced through options that all seemed to lead nowhere good. During lunch, I walked to my car and retrieved the flash drive from my purse, planning to mail it to a journalist I'd found who specialized in healthcare fraud. But when I reached the post office, a security guard from Riverside was standing by the entrance, casually scrolling through his phone. He looked up, made eye contact, and nodded at me with a slight smile. I turned around and went back to the office, the flash drive burning like a weight in my pocket. By 4 o'clock, I hadn't given Michael an answer, so I quietly packed my personal items into a box, left my company laptop on my desk, and walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. The security guard at the main entrance made a phone call as I passed, and I knew they were tracking every move I made. That evening, I stayed with my friend Ashley, too paranoid to go back to my apartment alone. I'd told her I was having issues at work but couldn't elaborate, and she didn't push for details. Around midnight, she woke me up to show me an email from Riverside's HR department that had been sent to all staff. It announced my immediate resignation for personal reasons and thanked me for my contributions during my brief tenure. My company email had already been deactivated, and when I checked my bank account, my final paycheck had been deposited with an additional month's severance I hadn't agreed to. Ashley asked if I wanted to talk about it, but I just stared at the screen, realizing they'd already written me out of the story. The next morning, she drove me to my apartment to get some clothes and important documents. The door to my apartment was closed but unlocked, something I would never do. Inside, nothing looked obviously disturbed at first glance, but small things were wrong in ways that made my skin prickle. My laptop was gone from the kitchen table where I'd left it, though the power cord remained plugged into the wall. The flash drive I'd hidden inside an old shoebox in my closet had vanished, along with all the printed documents I'd stuffed under my mattress. Even my personal files, tax returns, and bank statements had been carefully removed from my filing cabinet. But they'd left other things untouched: my jewelry box, my television, making it clear this wasn't a regular burglary. On my refrigerator, held by the same magnet I used for grocery lists, was a printed copy of my NDA with certain sections circled in red ink. Ashley grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door, whispering that we needed to leave immediately. We filed a police report that afternoon, though the officers seemed oddly uninterested when I mentioned my employer's name. They took notes, said they'd investigate, but their expression suggested this would go nowhere. Over the next week, strange things kept happening. My credit card was flagged for suspicious activity I hadn't made. My phone would ring with silence on the other end, and 2 different apartment applications were rejected without explanation. When I finally reached out to that journalist about the story, she told me her editor had killed the investigation after a call from Fitzgerald's lawyers threatening a defamation suit. I realized then that fighting this would mean losing everything, that they'd already won by making the cost of truth too high to pay. So I did what they wanted. I stayed quiet, moved to a different state, and started over in a field that had nothing to do with healthcare. Sometimes I check the news to see if Riverside ever gets exposed, but 3 years later, they're still operating, still billing insurance companies for procedures that never happen, and probably destroying anyone else who gets too close to the truth. It happened during a time when I thought my life had finally stabilized. I had been working at a medium-sized manufacturing company in Pennsylvania for a few years, handling internal audits and supplier payments. Nothing glamorous, but steady, predictable work. The kind that lets you sleep at night knowing every number matches. My supervisor, Mr. Caldwell, liked to joke that I was married to spreadsheets. I took pride in being meticulous, maybe too much for my own good. That habit is what started all of this. One afternoon, while cross-checking vendor invoices for a quarterly report, I noticed a small repetition in our payment log. The same invoice number appeared twice, 2 weeks apart, for the same amount. I figured it was a copy error and dug deeper. That is when I found 3 more, same structure, same formatting, but tied to supplier names I did not recognize. When I tried to look up their registration details, the company database said the vendors did not exist. No address, no tax record, nothing. Just blank entries sitting in our system like ghosts. I mentioned it quietly to Mr. Caldwell, not accusing, just trying to understand. He gave a small laugh, one of those dry ones that sound more like a dismissal than amusement. "Glitch in the software," he said, waving his coffee mug as if that settled it. "The system pulls old test data sometimes. Just clear the duplicates." I wanted to believe him, but his tone carried something offhand, too casual for someone whose department might be mishandling thousands of dollars. Still, I nodded and went back to my desk. The next morning, my access to the shared accounting drive was gone. I could not open the supplier logs, could not even reach the folders I worked on every day. I thought it was an IT error and emailed the support desk. By the time they got back to me, the logs had been updated. Someone had altered the audit trail to show that I was the one who created the duplicate invoices. My name, my ID, even my approval signature were attached to every single fake supplier entry. I remember sitting there staring at the screen trying to understand how a file I never touched could bear my credentials so perfectly. I went straight to Caldwell's office, but he was not there. His desk was cleared out except for a single coffee ring on the corner. No one seemed to know where he went, or maybe they were told not to talk. By noon, Human Resources called me in for a quick chat. The manager, Mrs. Halloran, said they had received an internal report of fraudulent entries in the accounts payable system, entries connected to my login. I tried to explain what I had discovered, how I had flagged the duplicates and was told it was a glitch, but her expression tightened. She said she could not discuss the details while there was an ongoing investigation. That afternoon, I tried to access my personal files on the local drive, but half of them were missing. Someone had replaced my working folder with an older version that made me look careless, like I had been hiding data. I checked the log timestamps and noticed they matched the same window when my account had been disabled the day before. I called IT again, and this time the technician hesitated before speaking. He said quietly, "Your name was flagged for manual monitoring. I should not even be talking to you." That was when I realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was an orchestrated setup. I spent the next evening combing through every backup I had kept on my flash drive at home, every invoice, every supplier record. But even my offline copies were tampered with. The metadata showed edits I never made, dated for times when I was not even at the office. It felt impossible, like someone had remote access to everything I touched. I started documenting my findings, printing out each version, hoping to piece together a timeline that could clear my name. But with each step forward, another piece of evidence surfaced against me, stronger than before. 2 days later, I got a call from a detective with the local police department. He said they had received a formal complaint from my company, accusing me of embezzlement and data manipulation. When I told him I was about to report the same crime but from the other side, there was a pause. He asked me to come in for questioning. That night I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of printouts. My name, my initials, my approval stamps, all perfectly forged. It was like watching my own identity rewritten by invisible hands. At the police station, the detective showed me printed emails supposedly sent from my company account. Each one approved payments to those phantom suppliers. The tone of the messages even sounded like me. Same phrasing, same punctuation habits. I pointed out that the timestamps did not match my work hours and that the email headers could be forged, but he only nodded, saying they would verify everything. I could tell by his expression that he thought I was guilty before I even sat down. The weight of something I did not do was already closing in around me. When I left the station, my phone buzzed non-stop with messages from coworkers. Some offered sympathy, others avoided saying anything direct. Then I got one that made me stop in the middle of the sidewalk. It was from an unknown number. You should have left it alone. No name, no context. Just that line. I deleted it immediately, but I could not shake the thought that whoever had sent it was close. Someone inside the same building. Maybe someone I saw every day. I began to realize this was not just about money. It was about control. About making someone disappear without physically touching them. In the days that followed, my bank accounts were frozen. The company suspended me pending investigation, and my access badge stopped working. Friends from the office stopped answering calls. The more I tried to defend myself, the deeper the hole seemed to get. Even the detective said it looked like I was trying to rewrite the narrative. The irony almost made me laugh. Everything I did to prove my innocence became more evidence of guilt. I barely slept, waiting for the knock on my door that could come at any moment. Eventually, I hired an independent forensic analyst, someone outside the company. It took months, but he found traces of a remote access tool installed through an internal maintenance update, the same patch that my department had been told to approve the week before everything began. When the report went public, the company quietly dropped the charges. No apology, no admission, nothing. I moved states shortly after. To this day, I keep every login on a separate device and never stay logged in anywhere longer than I need to. Because I know now, once someone decides to rewrite your history, they can make it look like you were never innocent to begin with. The night shifts at the old corporate building were supposed to be easy money. The place had been empty for years, waiting for a renovation project that never seemed to start. My job was simple: walk the halls every hour, make sure no one broke in, and keep an eye on the cameras. The company that hired me had a reputation for stretching their budget, which explained why the only working lights flickered like they were gasping for life. Still, it beat standing outside in the cold guarding construction sites, and I could bring my own coffee and music. The building was massive, 5 floors of cubicles, boardrooms, and forgotten offices. The kind of place where you could still smell old printer ink and stale coffee in the walls. Every sound carried in the emptiness, the hum of the vents, the buzz of the lights, even the echo of my own boots on the tile. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds, log the times, check the cameras, and sometimes sit by the main desk scrolling through my phone. But then small things started happening that made me feel like the building wasn't completely asleep. It began with the motion sensors. The system would ping randomly, showing movement in areas I had already locked. Most nights it happened on the 3rd floor, which didn't bother me too much at first. I figured it was rats, maybe even drafts setting off the sensors. But after a week, I noticed something strange in the logs. Every single alert came from the same spot, a corridor near the old executive offices where the doors had been sealed off years ago. The maintenance guy once told me that floor had been shut down after an accident, though he wouldn't say what kind. By the end of that week, the static on my radio began acting up too. At first it was just faint white noise, but soon it sounded like someone whispering through it. I'd switch channels thinking it was interference, but it always came back. The weirdest part was that sometimes, only for a second, I'd swear I heard my name. Eddie. Clear as day, right before the static cut out completely. I tried to laugh it off, but it's hard to stay calm when you hear your own name echo through an empty building. The following night, I made a note to check the cameras every time the motion alert came through. Around 2 in the morning, the monitor flickered, and one of the feeds blinked to black before coming back online. The timestamp matched the sensor trip. 3rd floor, east corridor. The feed only showed the sealed door at the end of the hallway. But something about the frame looked different. There was a faint shimmer on the glass panel, like the reflection of someone moving just out of view. When I went up there to check, the air felt heavy, and the light above the door buzzed like a wasp caught inside it. The tape around the frame was intact, though. Nothing looked disturbed. I started leaving my patrol for last on that floor. I told myself it was to save time, but the truth is I wanted to get it over with. The elevator made it worse. Every time I reached for the button, I'd see the faint smear of fingerprints on the inside mirror, like someone had been pressing their hand there. I was the only one with access after dark. Still, the prints would reappear by the next night. Once, I wiped them clean and watched through the camera feed later. Around 3:20, the elevator doors opened on their own and stayed that way for 10 seconds before closing again. By the 4th week, I could barely concentrate. My coffee went untouched most nights, and I kept the radio volume low just so I wouldn't have to hear the static creeping back in. Then one night, right before my shift ended, the elevator lights blinked. I heard the chime echo through the empty lobby. The display showed it stopping on the 3rd floor. I froze in place, watching as the numbers lingered there longer than usual. No one came down. After a minute, it started moving again, but instead of going to the lobby, it went up to the 5th floor. I took the stairs that night. The building's maintenance logs were stored in the small office behind reception. Out of curiosity, I checked the folder marked Incidents. Most of it was dull. Water leaks, power issues. But one report stood out. It was dated almost 15 years ago and mentioned a fire on the 3rd floor. A technician had died after getting trapped in the ventilation shaft. They said the area was sealed after that for safety reasons. The report ended with a note saying the elevator had malfunctioned during the evacuation. When I read that, I felt a chill crawl through me. Every time that elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, it was at the same time the fire had broken out. The next evening, I told myself I would ignore it. I turned off the elevator camera feed, left the volume on my radio low, and tried to focus on my route. But around the same time as always, the elevator chime rang again. I stared at the panel on the security desk. It had stopped on the 3rd floor. I hesitated, then picked up my flashlight and took the stairs. The moment I reached the 2nd floor landing, I heard the faint hum of machinery above me, like the air system had come alive for the first time in years. My flashlight beam shook as I reached the 3rd floor door. The tape across it was torn clean through. I opened it just far enough to see inside. The hallway was darker than the rest of the building, and a layer of fine dust covered the floor, except for a single trail of footprints leading toward the end of the corridor. They stopped right in front of the sealed office door, the one that showed up on the motion sensors. My chest tightened when the radio on my shoulder hissed again. This time, the voice came through more clearly. It said my name again, once, then twice, before fading out. The air smelled faintly like burned plastic. When I stepped back, the lights above me flickered so violently that the corridor strobed white and black. For a split second, I saw someone standing by the office door. A figure, shoulders slumped, wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform. I blinked and the hallway was empty again. I ran, leaving the door wide open behind me, my boots echoing through the stairwell. When I reached the lobby, the elevator doors slid open by themselves. The display said 3, then it went blank. I quit the next morning. The supervisor did not seem surprised. He just nodded and said, "That floor still giving you trouble?" As if he already knew. A few weeks later, I drove past the building and saw workers tearing down the front entrance. The elevator cables were hanging loose like veins through the exposed floors. I have worked other jobs since then, but no matter where I go, I still hear that faint static every now and then, like someone whispering through a dead frequency, still trying to say my name. The building where I worked had this strange quiet after 6 a.m. in the evening. Most of the call center agents rushed out as soon as their shift ended, but I liked finishing my reports before heading home. My cubicle was in the corner, next to a window that faced a dark parking lot filled with flickering lights. That evening, the sky looked heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything inside feel smaller. I remember the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft static in my headset, just background noise that made me feel less alone. I had been handling calls for a healthcare hotline, mostly people asking about coverage or waiting times. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My supervisor, Trevor, had left early for a dentist appointment, and the team leader on duty didn't seem to notice I stayed behind. Around 6:40, I saw a few coworkers passing by my row, laughing about something, one of them mentioning a drill over the sound of their chatter. I assumed it was one of those late safety checks they sometimes ran. They were gone within minutes. The floor grew still, and I sank into my chair, typing notes from the last call. My headset stayed on because I liked listening to the recorded prompts. They drowned out the echo of my own typing. I remember feeling oddly calm, almost cocooned by routine. When the power flickered once, I thought nothing of it. It happened sometimes when the maintenance crew tested circuits in the building. The lights dimmed, buzzed, then stabilized again. Maybe 10 minutes later, I noticed a faint smell, like burnt plastic. It was subtle at first, almost chemical, like the scent from overheated wires behind a computer. I looked around and saw nothing unusual. The red standby light on the printer glowed steadily. My monitor stayed bright, and the hallway outside my cubicle was still. I kept working, assuming it was just someone heating leftovers in the break room microwave again. The smell got stronger. I leaned back and took off my headset, realizing the office was far too silent. Usually the faint clatter of keyboards or the distant hum of vending machines filled the space, but now there was nothing. Just that low, uneven buzz from the ceiling lights. I stood up, peering over the cubicle walls toward the main corridor. The emergency exit sign glowed faintly red, and through the frosted glass partition I thought I saw movement, like shadows shifting quickly past the door. Curiosity pushed me closer to the hallway. That was when I noticed a thin trail of smoke creeping along the ceiling. My first thought was that something shorted out in the server room. I hurried to the stairwell door, but it wouldn't budge. The security system must have locked it automatically, which sometimes happened after hours. I tried my keycard. Nothing. A mechanical beep and a solid click that did not release. By now the haze was spreading faster. It stung my eyes and left a bitter taste in my mouth. I ran to the other end of the floor where another exit door was located. Same problem. Locked. My phone was on the desk, and for a second I hesitated to go back. The smoke was thicker near my cubicle. I used my sleeve to cover my face, stumbling back through the corridor. My head was spinning, and I could hear faint thuds somewhere below, maybe from people or heavy equipment. When I reached my desk again, I grabbed my phone and tried calling building security, but no one answered. The signal kept cutting in and out. I sent a text to a coworker, just saying there was smoke and I was still inside. I didn't realize until later that by then, the entire floor below had already been engulfed in flames. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, leaving only the dim emergency glow from the exit signs and the orange shimmer crawling under the door at the far end. I remember grabbing my jacket and waving it near the floor, hoping to push the smoke away just enough to breathe. The sound of the fire alarms finally reached me, muffled through the walls mixed with distant voices. I yelled for help, but my own voice barely carried. The air was so dense it felt like trying to speak underwater. Every step toward the far window grew heavier, the carpet warm under my shoes, sticky from melted plastic. Through the glass, I could see flashes of red, emergency lights reflecting against the neighboring building. I pressed my face close to the cool metal of the window frame, trying to catch a breath. The heat kept building behind me. Then I heard something slam, the main door being forced open from the other side. I dropped to the floor, coughing, as two figures in heavy suits burst through the haze. They shouted something I couldn't make out, then one of them grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the stairwell. The next few minutes were a blur of motion, alarms, and roaring noise. The firefighters carried me out through the service stairs, where the concrete walls were streaked black. When the cold air hit my face outside, I barely managed to keep my eyes open. Someone wrapped a blanket around me and told me I had been lucky. The heat sensors had tripped too late. I spent the night at the hospital with mild burns and smoke inhalation. They said I had passed out right before they reached me. Weeks later, I learned that the safety officer responsible for the evacuation had left early that night. He never checked my floor. The company did not say much publicly, only that procedures had been reviewed. I still work in offices sometimes, but I never stay after hours anymore. Every faint smell of burned dust from a heater or a computer cable still brings back that same quiet moment, the one right before I realized I was completely alone in a burning building. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The headlights of my Ford pickup swept across the driveway as I pulled in around 11 that Thursday night in October. I'd been putting in overtime at the warehouse for weeks, trying to save up enough to finally fix the roof before winter hit Colorado Springs hard. My wife Diane had taken the kids to her mother's place in Denver for the week, something about needing space to think about our marriage, which left me alone in that old two-story house my father had left me when he passed in 2014. The silence in the empty house had been getting to me lately, so I'd been staying late at work just to avoid it. As I cut the engine and grabbed my thermos from the passenger seat, movement in my peripheral vision made me pause. Someone was standing at the edge of my driveway, perfectly still, just watching my house like they were studying it for a test. It took me a second to recognize him in the darkness, but when I did, my whole body tensed up like I'd touched a live wire. Craig Novak, my next-door neighbor from before everything went to hell, was standing there in a worn denim jacket and jeans that hung loose on his frame. Prison had taken at least 30 pounds off him, and his hair, which used to be this wild mane he was so proud of, was now buzz-cut short and gray at the temples. He must have gotten out recently because I hadn't seen him around, and trust me, I would have noticed. The last time I'd seen Craig was 7 years ago when they loaded him into the police car after what he did. That night changed everything for my family. My dad never fully recovered from the head injury Craig gave him with that baseball bat during his drunken rampage, and watching him deteriorate over the following years, until his death was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to endure. I stayed in the truck for a moment, keys in my fist, debating whether to just back out and drive somewhere else until he left. But this was my house, my property, and I wasn't going to let him intimidate me on my own land. When I stepped out, Craig raised both hands in this slow, deliberate way, palms facing me like he was trying to calm a spooked horse. The porch light from his house cast these long shadows across his face, making the hollows under his cheekbones look deeper than they probably were. He'd always been a big guy, the kind who used his size to get his way in arguments. But now there was something different about how he carried himself, like he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. The October wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the asphalt between us, and I could smell cigarette smoke and something else on him, maybe cheap cologne trying to mask something worse. Craig took a step forward, still keeping his hands visible, and his voice came out rougher than I remembered, like he'd been gargling gravel. He said he'd been out for 3 weeks, staying at a halfway house downtown at first. but he'd moved back into his old place just yesterday because his mother had kept up the payments while he was gone. The old woman had died 2 years into his sentence, he told me, but she'd made sure he had somewhere to come back to. He kept talking, saying he'd found God inside, that he was in AA now, that he understood what he'd taken from me and my family. Every word sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror 100 times. He wanted to make amends, he said, part of his 12-step program, and he pulled out this crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, holding it out to me like it was supposed to mean something. I didn't move to take it, just stood there with my truck door still open behind me, ready to bolt if necessary. The paper fluttered in his hand as the wind picked up again, and I could see writing on it. Probably some letter his sponsor made him write or something. Craig's eyes kept darting between my face and the ground, never quite settling on either, and there was this twitch in his left cheek that hadn't been there before. When I didn't take the paper, he slowly lowered his hand and shoved it back in his pocket, but he didn't leave. Instead, he started talking about my dad, about how he remembered him working on cars in the garage on weekends, how he used to wave when Craig jogged by in the mornings before everything went bad. He said my father was a good man who didn't deserve what happened, and that he thought about that night every single day in his cell. The streetlight buzzed overhead, casting this sickly orange glow over everything, and I noticed Craig's knuckles were scarred in ways they hadn't been before, covered in these white lines that looked like a roadmap of violence. I finally found my voice and told him to get off my property, that whatever program he was working didn't require my participation or forgiveness. My words came out steadier than I felt, but my jaw was clenched so tight I could hear my teeth grinding. Craig nodded like he'd expected this, backing away with his hand still raised, saying he understood, that he'd be next door if I ever wanted to talk. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. He mentioned he'd noticed my tool shed door had been open earlier that day when he was moving boxes in, and he'd closed it for me to keep animals out. I hadn't been home all day, and I always locked that shed because that's where I kept my father's tools, the ones he'd collected over 40 years of working construction. The thought of Craig anywhere near those tools, touching things that belonged to my dad, made me want to put my fist through something. After he disappeared into his house, I went straight to the shed with my phone flashlight, my breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. The padlock was still there, locked like I'd left it that morning, but when I opened it and stepped inside, something was wrong. The tools were all there, hanging on their designated hooks just like my father had organized them. But his favorite hammer, the Estwing with the leather-wrapped handle he'd bought in 1975, was on the workbench instead of its hook. A thin layer of dust on the bench showed the outline where it had been placed recently. My father never left tools out, and neither did I. It was like muscle memory to put everything back exactly where it belonged. I picked up the hammer, feeling its familiar weight, and noticed something else. There were fresh scratches on the wooden handle, like someone had been gripping it too tight or maybe practicing swinging it. The next few days passed in this weird state of hypervigilance where I found myself checking locks twice, 3 times, before leaving for work. I installed a cheap security camera from Walmart, one of those that sends alerts to your phone, pointing it at the shed and driveway. Craig kept his distance, but I'd see him sometimes through the kitchen window, sitting on his porch smoking cigarettes and staring at nothing, or at least pretending to. Then things started disappearing. First, it was small stuff I could almost explain away. The garden hose nozzle I knew I'd left attached was gone, then showed up 2 days later, hanging on Craig's fence like it had been there all along. A pair of work gloves vanished from my truck bed, then appeared stuffed in my mailbox, damp with morning dew. Each time I thought about confronting him, but what would I say? That I was pretty sure he was stealing things just to return them. The police would laugh me out of the station. The security camera started picking up movement at night, but never anything definitive. Just shadows at the edge of its range, or sometimes a blur that could have been a cat or raccoon. But one night around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the notification sound and checked my phone to see Craig standing in my driveway, completely still, facing my house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there in pajama pants and a white t-shirt, barefoot despite the near-freezing temperature. I watched him through the live feed for 20 minutes and he never moved once, not even to shift his weight. His eyes were open but unfocused, and for a moment I wondered if he was sleepwalking. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, he turned and walked back to his house, moving normally like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat in my living room with my father's old shotgun across my lap, watching the windows. I called Diane the next morning, trying to keep my voice casual as I told her maybe she should stay at her mother's a bit longer. She asked if everything was all right, and I could hear the concern creeping into her voice, but I just said work was crazy, and I didn't want the kids to see me so stressed. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. How could I explain that our ex-con neighbor was playing some psychological game that I couldn't quite prove? The night after that phone call, my motion sensor lights kept triggering, one after another in sequence, like someone was walking circles around my house. Front porch, side yard, back deck, other side, then front porch again. Each time I looked out, nobody was there, but I could smell cigarette smoke through the cracked window. That same brand Craig had been chain smoking on his porch. The camera only showed empty yards and swaying shadows from the trees, but those lights didn't trigger from wind. Then came that Saturday morning. I'd actually managed to sleep for a few hours, exhaustion finally overwhelming paranoia, when I heard something scratching at the front door. Not knocking, scratching like a dog wanting to be let in. When I looked through the peephole, nobody was there, but there was something white on the porch. I grabbed the shotgun, checked through all the windows to make sure Craig wasn't lurking nearby, then cracked the door open. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded once, weighted down with a rock from my own garden. My mouth went dry as I picked it up and read the single line written in pencil, the handwriting shaky like someone had written it with their non-dominant hand. I still remember that night too. That's all it said, but it was enough to make my knees weak. Because Craig had been blackout drunk that night 7 years ago. So drunk he claimed in court, he didn't remember anything about attacking my father. His whole defense had been built on that claim, that he had no memory of breaking down our back door and coming after my dad with the bat from my own garage. I went straight to Craig's house, not even bothering to put on shoes, pounding on his door hard enough to shake the frame. When he answered, he looked genuinely confused, his hair sticking up at odd angles like he'd just woken up. He was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and wearing reading glasses I'd never seen before, looking for all the world like any harmless middle-aged man on a Saturday morning. When I shoved the note in his face demanding to know what kind of sick game he was playing, he squinted at it, then looked back at me with what seemed like real bewilderment. He swore he didn't write it, said he'd been at his AA meeting until late last night and had his sponsor's number if I wanted to verify. He even offered to show me his notebook where he kept his step work, holding it out with hands that weren't shaking at all. The handwriting in his notebook was completely different, neat and precise where the note's writing was chaotic. But when he reached for the note to look at it closer, I saw something that made everything else fade away. Under his fingernails there was dust, the same distinctive reddish construction dust that covered everything in my father's tool shed. I backed away from his door without saying another word, my mind racing faster than my feet as I crossed back to my property. Craig called after me, asking what was wrong, still playing his innocent act. But I didn't turn around. Inside my house, I called my old friend Tom, who worked for the sheriff's department, told him everything that had been happening, including the dust under Craig's nails. Tom listened without interrupting, then said something that changed everything. There had been 3 other reports in the past 2 weeks from families in the neighborhood, all describing similar experiences with items being moved, notes being left, someone standing in their yards at night. The thing was, Craig had solid alibis for all of those incidents. verified by multiple witnesses at his halfway house or AA meetings. Tom asked me to check something, to look for any medications in my bathroom that might have been moved or tampered with. That's when I found it. My prescription sleep medication that I'd stopped taking months ago was nearly empty when it should have been almost full. Tom came by that afternoon with another detective, and they found something I'd never have thought to look for. There were small holes drilled in the fence between Craig's yard and mine, painted over to match the wood, but positioned perfectly to watch my house from his bedroom window. They also found a journal in Craig's room, hidden inside an old heating vent, where he'd documented everything about our family for years before he went to prison, including detailed observations about my father's routines, my work schedule, even notes about which lights we left on at night. The really sick part was that he'd been planning this since before he got out, had written about how he was going to make me understand what it felt like to lose someone slowly, to watch them deteriorate like my father had. But he'd been smart about it, making sure he had alibis, probably using the sleep medication he'd been stealing to make sure I'd be groggy enough not to catch him. The dust under his nails was his only mistake, probably from his last visit to the shed that morning before I confronted him. They arrested Craig that evening for criminal harassment, breaking and entering, and theft of prescription medication. As they led him to the police car, he didn't say a word, just stared at me with this blank expression that was somehow worse than anger would have been. His lawyer got him a plea deal for 2 years with mandatory psychiatric treatment, which seemed like nothing compared to what he'd put me through. But at least it got him away from my family. I changed all the locks, installed a real security system, and patched every one of those holes in the fence myself. Diane and the kids came home the following week, and I told her everything, showed her the police reports and the photos of Craig's journal. She held me for a long time that night, both of us realizing how much worse it could have been if I hadn't noticed that dust under his fingernails. The house feels different now, even with Craig gone. Sometimes I still check the locks 3 times before bed, and I replaced every tool in that shed. Couldn't stand touching the ones he'd handled. But the worst part is knowing he'll get out again someday, and that journal showed he's patient enough to wait years for his revenge. Tom told me Craig's obsession started because my father had called the cops on him once for a domestic dispute years before the attack, something I never even knew about. Such a small thing that led to all of this. I've been teaching Diane how to use the security system and bought her pepper spray for her keychain. We're thinking about moving, maybe somewhere across town or even out of state. But for now, we're taking it one day at a time. At least now I know I wasn't losing my mind, that every instinct telling me something was wrong had been right. Sometimes that's all you can hold on to, the knowledge that you trusted yourself when it mattered most. The cardboard boxes were still stacked against the living room wall when Brandon first knocked on our door that September afternoon. My roommate Kevin and I had just signed the lease 3 days earlier, desperate to find something affordable after our previous landlord decided to sell. The place on Willow Court wasn't much to look at, just a standard 2-bedroom in a complex built sometime during the Reagan administration, but the rent was manageable and it was only 20 minutes from both our jobs. Kevin answered the door while I was untangling Ethernet cables, and I heard this overly enthusiastic voice introducing himself as our across-the-hall neighbor. When I walked over to say hello, Brandon was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, grinning like we were long-lost relatives at a family reunion. He was probably mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt tucked into khakis that looked like they'd been ironed with military precision. And he had this way of maintaining eye contact for just a beat too long. Kevin and I exchanged glances while Brandon launched into a detailed history of every tenant who'd lived in our unit for the past 6 years. He knew their names, their jobs, where they'd moved afterward, even what kind of car the previous couple drove. The casserole dish grew heavy in his hands as he talked, but he never set it down, just kept holding it out like an offering, while describing how quiet the building usually was, how the mail carrier came at exactly 2:15 every day except Sundays, how the dumpsters got emptied on Wednesdays at 6 in the morning sharp. When he finally handed over the casserole and left, Kevin immediately Googled whether you could hide cameras in food. We laughed about it then, joking that we'd already found the complex's resident weirdo. The casserole was actually pretty good, some kind of chicken and rice thing with too much cheese, and we figured Brandon was just lonely. Lots of single middle-aged guys get awkward around people, especially younger folks who remind them of what they used to be. Neither of us touched the second casserole he brought the next day. The gifts started appearing about a week later. First, it was a 6-pack of craft beer left on our doormat with a sticky note that said, "Noticed you guys carrying Sierra Nevada upstairs. Thought you might enjoy these." The thing was, we'd carried those beers up at 11:30 at night after a late grocery run. Then came the magazine subscriptions we never ordered, all addressed to us, but clearly paid for by someone else. Sports Illustrated for Kevin because Brandon had seen him wearing a Lakers jersey once. Wired for me after he'd spotted an old Arduino kit through our window when the blinds were cracked. Each gift came with these little notes demonstrating just how much attention he was paying to our daily routines. He knew Kevin left for his shift at the hospital at 6:45 each morning. He knew I worked from home on Fridays and always ordered Thai food from the place on Riverside Drive. The notes were always cheerful, always signed with a smiley face, always written in this perfect elementary school teacher handwriting that made my neck tense up. Kevin started keeping a log after Brandon showed up at his gym across town. Not the community center 5 minutes away, not the Planet Fitness by the grocery store, but the specific CrossFit box in Northside where Kevin had been going for months before we moved. Brandon claimed it was pure coincidence, said his cousin had recommended the place, but he somehow ended up in Kevin's same morning class 3 days in a row. He'd position himself at the next station during circuits, offering form tips and asking about Kevin's workout history, his diet, whether I ever joined him for sessions. The owner told Kevin that Brandon had specifically asked about the schedule for the tall black guy who drives the blue Mazda before signing up for a membership. That same week I ran into Brandon at the coffee shop where I sometimes worked in the afternoons when the apartment got too stuffy. He walked in carrying a laptop I'd never seen him use before, acted surprised to see me there, then sat at the table directly behind mine for 3 hours without ordering anything after his initial coffee. We decided to talk to the property manager after the laundry room incident. It was a Monday night, close to 2 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep because of a project deadline. I figured I'd throw in a load of clothes since no one else would be using the machines at that hour. The laundry room was in the basement, lit by these harsh fluorescent tubes that made everything look greenish, and you had to walk past the storage units to get there. I was loading quarters into the washer when I heard breathing behind me. Brandon was standing in the doorway wearing pajama pants and a white undershirt, holding an empty laundry basket. No detergent, no clothes, just the basket pressed against his stomach. He said he couldn't sleep either, asked if I wanted company while my clothes washed. When I said I was heading right back upstairs, he mentioned that Kevin had seemed stressed lately, wondered if we were having roommate problems, if maybe I needed someone to talk to about it. The whole time he was blocking the doorway, not aggressively, just standing there like he'd forgotten how doorways worked. I had to say excuse me 3 times before he stepped aside. The property manager, Nancy, acted like we were overreacting until we showed her Kevin's log. 3 pages of dates and times, Brandon appearing at the mailboxes whenever we checked mail, Brandon carrying groceries to his door at the exact moment we'd come home from shopping, Brandon taking out trash that couldn't have been full because he'd emptied it 12 hours earlier. Nancy's expression changed when she read about the gym and the coffee shop. She said she'd talk to him, give him a warning about respecting boundaries. 2 days later, Brandon knocked on our door to apologize. He brought homemade cookies this time, chocolate chip with walnuts, and his apology was so detailed it became its own form of harassment. He apologized for making us uncomfortable at the gym, at the coffee shop, in the laundry room at 2:18 in the morning on Monday. He knew the exact times, the exact locations, even mentioned things we hadn't told Nancy about, like how he'd accidentally walked behind me to my car after work the previous Friday, or how he'd happened to be at the same gas station Kevin used on Sunday mornings. Each apology contained information that proved he was still watching, still cataloging our movements, still treating our lives like a TV show he couldn't stop binging. Things went quiet for about a week after that. Brandon stopped appearing everywhere, stopped leaving gifts, even seemed to avoid eye contact when we passed in the hallway. Kevin thought maybe Nancy's warning had actually worked, but I kept feeling this weight in my chest whenever I came home. The silence felt intentional, calculated, like when a storm suddenly stops and you know something worse is coming. Then Kevin noticed his bike had been moved in the storage room. Not stolen, just shifted 3 spaces over from where he'd locked it. The chain wrapped differently than he always did it. I found a receipt from a hardware store tucked under my windshield wiper one morning, paid in cash, for items I couldn't quite make out because the ink was smudged. The timestamp showed it was purchased at 3:47 in the morning. We started finding these little signs that someone had been in spaces we thought were ours. A window we never opened was cracked 1/2 inch. The welcome mat was turned at a different angle. Kevin's laundry detergent was fuller than it should have been, like someone had added more to it. We installed a doorbell camera without telling Nancy. Figured we needed proof before anyone would take us seriously. The first few nights showed nothing unusual, just us coming and going. The occasional delivery driver, a few other tenants passing by. But on the 4th night, the motion sensor triggered at 3:22 in the morning. Brandon was standing directly in front of our door, not moving, not knocking, just standing there facing the door like he was listening. He stayed for exactly 12 minutes, then walked back to his apartment. The next night, 3:22 again, 14 minutes this time. He never looked at the camera, kept his head tilted slightly down, but we could see his lips moving like he was having a conversation. Kevin wanted to call the police right then, but I convinced him to wait until we had more footage. We needed them to understand this wasn't just a neighbor being friendly or confused. The 3rd night, Brandon showed up with something in his hand. He knelt down and slipped what looked like a folded piece of paper under our door, then stood up and pressed his palm flat against the door for almost 30 seconds before walking away. The paper was a printed screenshot of Kevin's Instagram story from 2 years ago, before we'd even met each other, before either of us had heard of Willow Court. It showed Kevin at some beach in California with friends, and someone had drawn red circles around everyone's faces except Kevin's. On the back, in that same perfect handwriting, it said, "They don't deserve you." We found 4 more papers throughout the day, slipped into places Brandon shouldn't have been able to access. One in Kevin's gym bag that had been locked in his car. One inside my laptop case in the apartment. One folded into the exact middle page of a book I was reading. The last one was in our freezer, wrapped in plastic, placed between 2 boxes of frozen vegetables we'd bought the day before. That one was a photo of me from high school that I'd never posted online, standing in front of my parents' house in Ohio. I hadn't been back there in 7 years. The only copy of that photo existed in an album my mom kept in her basement. Kevin called the police while I threw up in the bathroom, my whole body shuddering as I tried to figure out how Brandon could have gotten that picture. The officers who came seemed skeptical, until we showed them the doorbell footage and the photos. They took our statements, looked at Kevin's log, said they'd go talk to Brandon. We watched through the peephole as they knocked on his door across the hall. No answer. They knocked again, announced themselves, waited. After 10 minutes, they told us Brandon wasn't home and they'd try again later. But 20 minutes after the police left, we heard Brandon's door open and close. He'd been in there the whole time, just refusing to answer. That night, neither of us slept. We pushed the couch against the door and took turns staying awake. Kevin with a baseball bat he'd bought that afternoon, me with my phone ready to call 911. Around 4 in the morning, we heard footsteps in the hallway that stopped right outside our door. The doorbell camera alert went off on my phone. Brandon was back, but this time he was holding something up to the peephole. It was another photo, this one of Kevin and me inside our apartment, taken from a high angle like it was shot from the ceiling, showing us watching TV on the couch just 2 nights earlier. Kevin lost it. He yanked the couch away from the door and stormed into the hallway, but Brandon was already gone. That's when Kevin looked up at the smoke detector mounted between our door and Brandon's. Something seemed wrong about it. The LED light that usually blinked green was dark, and the casing looked slightly newer than the one further down the hall. Kevin grabbed a stepladder from our apartment and climbed up while I held it steady. When he popped open the detector's cover, a small camera fell out and dangled by its wire. Not just a basic camera either, but something sophisticated with night vision capabilities and a wide-angle lens. We checked the other detector near the stairwell and found another one. These weren't just watching our door. They were angled to see through the gap under it when we opened it, to catch glimpses inside our apartment. Kevin called 911 while I ran to Nancy's unit and pounded on her door until she answered in her robe. The police arrived within minutes this time, and Nancy used her master key to open Brandon's apartment when he wouldn't respond. The place was empty. Not just that he wasn't home, but completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, nothing except hundreds of photos taped to every wall. The photos covered 3 years of Kevin's life and 18 months of mine, long before we'd moved to Willow Court. Pictures from grocery stores, from previous apartments, from family gatherings we'd attended in different states. There were detailed notes written directly on the walls in permanent marker, documenting our routines, our preferences, our relationships. One wall was dedicated entirely to analyzing Kevin's workout schedule and dietary habits. Another mapped out my work patterns and coffee shop visits across 3 different cities I'd lived in. The police found Brandon's real name was Aaron Fitzgerald, and he'd been renting the apartment for 4 years, going through tenant after tenant, selecting certain ones to document. They found external hard drives with thousands of hours of footage from the smoke detector cameras and others he'd hidden in the laundry room vents and stairwell emergency lights. Nancy broke down crying when she realized he'd been doing this under her watch. We stayed in a hotel that night while the police processed the scene. They arrested Aaron 2 days later at a storage facility 40 miles away, where he'd been living in a modified unit, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from cameras he'd installed in 2 other apartment complexes. We moved out before the week ended, broke our lease without penalty, and found a house to rent on the other side of the city. Sometimes I still check doorways twice and look up at smoke detectors longer than I should, but at least now when someone knocks on our door with cookies, it's just a neighbor being friendly. The divorce had been finalized just after my 31st birthday, and finding an affordable place in a decent school district felt like winning the lottery. My daughter Lily was 7, still young enough to think moving was an adventure, and she'd spent the first week in our new house exploring every corner while I unpacked boxes. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets lined with oak trees, kids riding bikes after school. The kind of place where people actually waved when they passed you on the sidewalk. Our next-door neighbor, an older man named Harold, had introduced himself the day we moved in, bringing over a casserole dish and telling me how nice it was to have a family in the neighborhood again. Harold must have been in his 70s, thin and stooped with age, always wearing the same beige cardigan no matter the weather. He lived alone in the house to our right, kept his lawn immaculate, and seemed to spend most of his time tending to his garden or sitting on his porch with his orange tabby cat. At first, I appreciated having a friendly neighbor, especially one who seemed so harmless and grandfatherly. He'd wave from his porch when Lily played in the yard, sometimes calling out compliments about what a well-behaved child she was, how lucky I was to have such a sweet little girl. I'd smile and wave back, grateful that at least one person in this new place had made us feel welcome. The interaction started small, innocent enough that I barely noticed the pattern forming. Harold would appear at the fence whenever Lily was outside, holding a plate of homemade sugar cookies, the kind with pink frosting and sprinkles that kids go crazy for. He'd lean over the chain-link fence separating our yards, his weathered hands gripping the metal. Calling out to her in that raspy voice of his, Lily would run over, delighted by the attention and treats, while I watched from the kitchen window, telling myself this was just what neighbors did in places like this. He started mentioning his cat, Whiskers, saying how lonely the poor thing got during the day, wondering if maybe Lily would like to come over sometime and keep him company. Then came the toys, little things at first. A rubber ball that had supposedly rolled into his yard months ago. A set of colored pencils he claimed to have found while cleaning his garage. Each time he'd wait until I was inside or distracted, approaching Lily directly with these gifts, always with a story about why she should have them. One afternoon, I came outside to find him teaching her how to make a cat's cradle with string, their heads bent close together, his fingers guiding hers through the patterns. The sight made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. Watching this old man's hands touching my daughter's, even for something as innocent as a string game. When I called Lily inside, Harold straightened up slowly, that permanent smile of his never wavering, and mentioned he'd be going out of town soon, wondering if Lily might want to feed Whiskers while he was gone. That evening, after Lily was in bed, I sat at my laptop with a glass of wine, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting the stress of the divorce and the move turn me into one of those helicopter parents. But my fingers typed his name into the search bar anyway, Harold Garrison, along with our street address. The first few results were nothing, some mentions in local gardening club newsletters, a photo from a community barbecue 5 years ago. But then I found it. Buried on the third page of results, a news article from 2018 about complaints filed against a Harold Garrison in a neighboring county. The details were vague. Something about inappropriate behavior around minors at a public pool, charges that were dropped when witnesses failed to appear in court. My mouth went dry as I clicked through to another link. A community forum post warning about an elderly man matching Harold's description, who'd been seen taking photos of children at a playground. I spent the next hour digging deeper, finding fragments of information that painted an increasingly unsettling picture. There were 2 more incidents. One from 2016, where he'd been asked to leave a youth center after parents complained about him offering to give swimming lessons to young girls. Another from just last year, where police had questioned him about loitering near an elementary school. Nothing had ever stuck. No convictions, no registered offender status. Just a trail of complaints and suspicions that followed him from town to town. The wine glass sat forgotten beside me as I stared at the screen, my mind racing through every interaction he'd had with Lily, every cookie, every toy, every moment I'd left them alone together even for a second. The string game kept replaying in my head, his spotted hands manipulating the yarn around my daughter's small fingers, and I had to run to the bathroom, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and rage. After splashing cold water on my face, I went to check on Lily, needing to see her safe in her bed, her stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, breathing steadily in the glow of her nightlight. I pulled her door nearly closed and went to every window in the house, checking locks, pulling curtains tight, my heart hammering against my ribs. From the kitchen window, I could see Harold's house, dark except for a single light in what I assumed was his living room. As I watched, the curtain moved slightly, and I jerked back, even though I knew he couldn't possibly see me in the darkened kitchen. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts, wondering who I could call, what I could say. The police would want evidence, something more than old complaints and dropped charges, and I had nothing concrete, just a mother's instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. Sleep was impossible that night, every small sound making me jump, every car passing on the street sending me to peek through the blinds. Around 2 a.m, I heard a door close softly, and when I crept to the front window, I saw Harold's porch light on, though I couldn't see him anywhere. I stood there for 20 minutes watching waiting, until finally the light clicked off and everything went quiet again. The next morning, I kept Lily inside despite the beautiful weather, making up excuses about needing her help with organizing her room. Harold appeared in his garden around 10, pruning his roses with methodical precision, occasionally glancing toward our house. When Lily asked if she could go outside and play, I told her maybe later, my voice too bright, too forced, and she gave me that look kids get when they know something's wrong, but adults won't explain what. The day dragged on with painful slowness, Lily growing increasingly restless and cranky from being cooped up inside. I tried to distract her with movies and baking projects, but my attention kept drifting to the windows, checking if Harold was still out there. He seemed to be finding every possible reason to stay in his front yard, sweeping his already spotless walkway, adjusting his garden hose, trimming bushes that didn't need trimming. Around 4 in the afternoon, he knocked on our door, and I watched through the peephole as he stood there holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, that same benign smile plastered on his face. I didn't answer, holding my breath, one hand pressed against Lily's mouth when she started to ask who was at the door. He knocked again, waited, then finally left the plate on our doorstep and shuffled back to his house. Later, when I was sure he'd gone inside, I quickly grabbed the plate and threw it directly in the garbage, cookies and all. As evening approached, I made dinner while Lily colored at the kitchen table, her mood improved by the promise of ice cream for dessert if she ate all her vegetables. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when movement outside caught my eye. Harold was standing on the sidewalk directly across from our house, not on his property, not walking anywhere, just standing there facing our front door. He wasn't doing anything threatening, technically, just standing on a public sidewalk, but the deliberateness of it, the way he positioned himself with a clear view of our entrance, made my skin prickle with alarm. I pulled out my phone and started recording through the kitchen window, needing some kind of proof, some documentation of this behavior. He stood there for 43 minutes. I know because I filmed the entire time, my phone growing hot in my grip, until finally a couple walking their dog approached and he turned, walking slowly back toward his house, as if he'd just been out for an evening stroll. That night, after triple-checking every lock and moving a chair against the front door, I called my ex-husband, something I'd sworn I wouldn't do unless it was an absolute emergency. I explained everything, the research I'd found, the standing and watching, how Harold seemed to be escalating his interest in Lily. My ex listened, then said what I knew he would say, that without concrete evidence, without Harold actually doing something illegal, there wasn't much anyone could do. He suggested I install security cameras, maybe talk to other neighbors, see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. After we hung up, I sat in Lily's doorway watching her sleep, my laptop open as I ordered cameras for next day delivery, along with new deadbolts and window locks. I dozed off there sometime after 3, waking with a stiff neck when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that just said, "She looked lovely in her pink pajamas yesterday." My entire body went rigid as I read the message again, then looked down at Lily, who was indeed wearing her pink unicorn pajamas, the same ones she'd worn yesterday morning when I'd let her grab the newspaper from the porch. I screenshotted the message, my fingers trembling as I called 911, finally having something concrete to report. The police arrived within 15 minutes, 2 officers who took my statement and looked at all the evidence I'd gathered. They went next door to talk to Harold, and I watched from my window as he answered his door in his bathrobe, looking confused and frail, shaking his head repeatedly. When they came back, they told me he claimed to know nothing about any text message, that he didn't even own a cell phone, just his landline. They said they'd file a report, suggested I keep documenting everything, and mentioned I might want to consider a restraining order, though without proof he'd sent the message, it would be difficult to obtain. After they left, I packed 2 suitcases, grabbed Lily, still in her pajamas, and drove to my sister's house 3 hours away, leaving the cameras and locks in their delivery boxes on the porch. deciding that no house, no matter how perfect the neighborhood seemed, was worth risking my daughter's safety. We stayed at my sister's for 2 weeks while I figured out what to do, eventually breaking my lease and finding a new place in a gated apartment complex with security and key fob access, somewhere Harold couldn't just wander by. I had to explain to Lily why we moved so suddenly, settling on a version of the truth that wouldn't terrify her. Just that sometimes grown-ups don't make good choices about boundaries, and we needed to live somewhere with better rules. The property management company forwarded me mail for a while, mostly junk and bills, but one day there was a hand-addressed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, taken from a distance but clearly showing Lily on our old porch in those pink pajamas reaching for the newspaper. On the back, in spidery handwriting, it said, "Such a shame you had to leave." I took it straight to the police station, added it to the file, but nothing ever came of it. They increased patrols in the old neighborhood for a while, but Harold never did anything else they could arrest him for. 6 months later, I got a call from our old neighbor across the street, a woman named Beth who I'd only spoken to once or twice. She'd found my number through the property management company, wanted to let me know that Harold had been arrested. Not for anything involving children, but for breaking into another neighbor's house while they were on vacation, apparently looking for something, though nobody could figure out what. When they searched his house, they found boxes of photographs, hundreds of them, all of children from the neighborhood spanning back years, pictures taken from bushes, through windows, from his car. They found pictures of Lily, dozens of them, including ones from inside our house that he must have taken through windows when we weren't paying attention. Beth said the detective wanted my contact information, that they were building a bigger case now, connecting him to incidents in 3 different states. I hung up and held Lily extra tight that night, grateful for my instincts, for running when every logical part of me said I was overreacting. Harold got 15 years, not nearly enough, but at least he was finally behind bars where he couldn't watch anyone's daughter through their kitchen window, couldn't stand on sidewalks planning God knows what. After splashing cold water on my face, I checked on Lily, watching her sleep peacefully with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, completely unaware of the danger living 20 feet away. I pulled her bedroom curtains closed, making sure they overlapped completely, then went through the house doing the same with every window that faced Harold's property. My phone buzzed with a text from my ex-husband asking about weekend plans, but I couldn't focus on anything except the old man next door and what I should do about him. Calling the police seemed pointless. What would I say? That my neighbor gave my daughter cookies and had some old allegations that never went anywhere. I knew how that would sound, like a hysterical single mother making drama out of nothing. But I also knew what I'd found, and more importantly, I knew that gut feeling I'd been ignoring, that primitive maternal instinct that had been screaming at me every time Harold looked at my daughter. The decision to keep Lily inside the next day led to the kind of tantrum only a 7-year-old denied her outdoor time could produce. She pressed her face against the living room window, whining about wanting to ride her bike, to play hopscotch, to do anything other than watch cartoons and color. Around noon, Harold knocked on our door, holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, his excuse being that he'd made too many brownies and thought we might enjoy them. Standing in my doorway, he peered past me into the house, his pale eyes searching, and asked if Lily was feeling all right since he hadn't seen her outside all morning. The casual way he tracked my daughter's routine made my skin prickle with revulsion, but I managed to keep my voice steady, telling him she had a cold, taking the plate with hands that wanted to slam the door in his face. He lingered on my porch for another minute, mentioning again that he'd be taking a trip soon, just overnight, and would really appreciate if Lily could check on Whiskers, even offered to pay her $5 for the help. The lease paperwork from 2016 still sits in my desk drawer, right next to the pepper spray my mom bought me when I signed it. I just finished my master's degree that May, and this studio apartment in Portland felt like the first real step into adulthood. The building was nothing special, just a converted warehouse from the 60s with thin walls and radiators that clanged like someone was beating them with a wrench. But the rent was manageable on my salary as a lab technician at the hospital. For the first 8 months, everything was perfect. I'd come home from my shifts, usually around 7 in the evening, kick off my scrubs, and enjoy the quiet sanctuary of my own space. The only neighbor I ever noticed was Mrs. Huang across the hall, who'd sometimes leave containers of dumplings outside my door when she made too many. Then Walter moved into the unit directly below mine. I remember that Tuesday in January because I was carrying groceries up the stairs when I saw him for the first time, standing in his doorway watching the movers haul in a leather recliner that looked like it belonged in a hunting lodge. He had this way of standing that made him seem larger than he actually was, shoulders rolled forward, arms crossed tight against his barrel chest. His hair was thinning on top but long in the back, greasy strands that touched his collar, and when he smiled at me, only half his mouth moved, like the other side was holding on to some private joke. I nodded politely, shifted my grocery bags to one arm to wave, and immediately regretted it when he took it as an invitation to introduce himself. His handshake was damp and he held on a beat too long, telling me how nice it was to finally meet a neighbor, how quiet the building seemed, how he hoped we'd be friends. The first complaint came 3 weeks later. I'd gotten home late from a double shift, around 11 at night, and was making myself a quick dinner when I heard the pounding on my door. Walter stood there in a stained undershirt and sweatpants, his face red and puffy like he'd been drinking. He said my footsteps were keeping him awake, that I walked like I was trying to stomp through the floor, and didn't I have any consideration for the people living below me? I apologized, genuinely confused because I'd been wearing socks and trying to move quietly. But he kept going, saying the microwave humming was like a drill in his skull, that even the water running through the pipes sounded like a waterfall in his bedroom. I promised to be more careful, and he left, but not before leaning in close enough that I could smell the beer and something else, something sour like milk left out too long. After that night, I became hyper-aware of every sound I made. I started taking my shoes off in the hallway, tiptoed everywhere like I was walking on glass, even stopped using my microwave after 9. But the complaints kept coming. He'd text me at all hours, long rambling messages about how I was doing it on purpose, how I was trying to drive him crazy, how women like me thought we were so much better than everyone else. I showed them to my friend Natalie, who works security at the hospital, and she told me to stop responding, to document everything, to call the landlord. But our landlord, Mr. Jameson, was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. He said neighbor disputes weren't his problem, that we needed to work it out like adults, and besides, Walter always paid his rent on time. The day I stopped responding to his texts was a Wednesday in March. I'd finally had enough after he sent me 17 messages in 2 hours while I was trying to sleep before a morning shift. I blocked his number, and for about 6 hours, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. But when I got home that evening, there was a note shoved under my door, written in pencil so hard it had torn through the paper in places. He called me names I won't repeat, said I was a stuck-up princess who needed to learn some respect, that ignoring him was the biggest mistake I'd ever make. The next morning, another note, this one longer, describing in detail all the ways he could hear me moving around, like he was keeping a log of my every step. He knew when I showered, when I cooked, when I watched TV, even when I rolled over in bed. That's when I stopped sleeping properly. I'd lie there in the dark, straining to hear any sound from below, wondering if he was awake too, listening to me breathe. I bought a white noise machine, but it made things worse because then I couldn't hear if someone was at my door. I started sleeping on my couch instead of my bed, thinking maybe he couldn't hear me as well from the living room. But the notes kept coming, each one angrier, more unhinged, accusing me of deliberately tormenting him with my existence. He'd slip them under the door at random times, and I'd hear his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he was there. Sometimes I'd find them when I left for work at 6 in the morning, meaning he'd been up all night writing them, or worse, waiting for the right moment to deliver them. I finally called the police on a Saturday afternoon after I found a note that made my stomach turn to ice. He'd written about how thin the floors were, how he could map out my apartment just by listening, how he knew exactly where my bed was positioned because he could hear the frame creak when I got in. The two officers who showed up looked bored before I even finished explaining. They said, unless he made a direct threat of violence, it was a civil matter. One of them, Officer Murphy, actually suggested I try being friendlier, maybe bake him some cookies, work things out neighbor to neighbor. They did knock on his door, but Walter didn't answer, and they shrugged and left. 20 minutes after their patrol car pulled away, I heard him laughing through the floor, this low, grinding sound that went on until I grabbed my keys and left, spending the night at Natalie's place. The tapping started the following Monday night. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe a mouse in the walls, just this soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere near my bedroom. But it was too regular, too deliberate, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 like someone knocking politely on a door. I followed the sound, pressing my ear to different spots on the floor until I realized it was coming from directly under my bed. My apartment had hardwood floors with a few area rugs, and when I got down on my stomach with my phone flashlight, I could see between the old floorboards and spots. The tapping stopped the second I got close, like whatever was making it could sense me there. I stayed frozen on my bedroom floor for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing, waiting, and then it started again, this time more insistent, almost playful. I convinced myself it had to be the heating system or maybe Walter banging on his ceiling with a broom handle to mess with me. But deep down, something felt wrong about how precisely located the sound was, always right under wherever I happened to be in the bedroom. I started avoiding the room entirely, grabbing my clothes for the next day and changing in the bathroom, sleeping on the couch permanently. But 2 nights later, the tapping followed me. First under the couch, then under the kitchen table when I sat there with my laptop, then under the bathroom when I tried to take a shower. It was like he had a map of my apartment and was following my every move from below, announcing his presence with those soft, maddening taps. I called Natalie, begging her to come over and listen, to tell me I wasn't going insane. But by the time she arrived, the tapping had stopped completely. That's when I remembered something the building superintendent had mentioned when I first moved in, something about maintenance access panels in each unit for the plumbing and electrical work. He'd pointed to a painted-over square in my bedroom closet floor, said it connected to a crawl space that ran between the floors, told me never to open it because it was full of asbestos or lead paint or some other hazard that would cost the owner too much to fix properly. I'd forgotten about it completely until that moment, standing in my living room with Natalie, both of us listening to the silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. We went to my bedroom closet, pushed aside the boxes of winter clothes and old textbooks, and there it was, that square outline in the floor, except the paint around the edges was cracked now, little white flakes scattered on the dark wood like snow, and one corner of the panel was slightly raised, just enough that you could see the black gap underneath if you looked at the right angle. Natalie grabbed a screwdriver from my kitchen drawer and we pried the panel up together, our phone's lights aimed down into the darkness. The crawl space was maybe 3 feet high, filled with pipes and wiring and decades of dust, but there were clear drag marks in the dirt, fresh ones leading from the direction of Walter's apartment to directly under my bedroom. And there, caught on a nail, was a piece of fabric from what looked like the same stained undershirt he'd worn that first night he complained. We could see where he'd cleared a path, pushed aside insulation, even set up what looked like a foam pad right under where my bed would be. Natalie was already calling 911 while I stood there, staring at a notebook he'd left behind, filled with pages and pages of times and descriptions, every sound I'd made for weeks, noting when I cried, when I talked on the phone, when I breathed too heavily. The last entry from just hours before simply said, Tonight she'll finally understand we belong together. The police found Walter in the crawl space when they arrived, curled up on that foam pad directly under my bed, with a battery-powered lantern and a thermos of coffee like he was camping. He didn't resist when they dragged him out through his own apartment's access panel. Just kept saying I'd invited him, that the way I walked was a code, that my footsteps had been spelling out messages only he could understand. They arrested him for breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. And at the trial 4 months later, his lawyer tried to argue mental illness, but the notebook showed too much planning, too much careful calculation. He got 18 months in prison and a restraining order that might as well be toilet paper, for all the good it would do if he decided to come back. I moved out the next day, stayed with Natalie until I found a new place, a third-floor apartment in a building with proper security and no crawl spaces. Sometimes at night, when the upstairs neighbors walk around, I still find myself holding my breath, listening for that soft tapping, waiting for it to follow me to my new home. Finding a place we could actually afford felt impossible until we stumbled across that duplex listing in early April. My girlfriend Ashley and I had been sharing a cramped studio since she finished her nursing degree, and we were desperate for space where we wouldn't trip over each other constantly. At 29, I was finally making decent money as a tax preparer, enough that splitting rent on a 2-bedroom didn't seem like financial suicide anymore. Ashley worked rotating shifts at the hospital, 12 hours that left her exhausted, but paid well enough to cover her student loans and still have something left over. We toured the place on a Saturday morning, and within an hour we were signing papers with the landlord, an older guy named Frank, who kept emphasizing how quiet the neighborhood was. He mentioned our neighbor would be sharing the other half of the duplex, some guy named Douglas who'd been there for years and never caused any problems. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and we spent that entire weekend arranging furniture and arguing about where to hang pictures. Ashley had this collection of framed botanical prints from her grandmother that she wanted everywhere, while I just wanted somewhere to put my gaming setup without getting lectured about the mess of cables. We could hear our neighbor through the shared wall, especially at night when everything else got quiet. Footsteps creaking on floorboards, moving from room to room in patterns that seemed almost mechanical, like he was following the same path over and over. His television stayed on constantly, that pale flickering light visible through our bedroom blinds at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Ashley said maybe he had trouble sleeping, or worked from home on some weird schedule. We figured everyone had their quirks, and at least he wasn't throwing parties or playing drums. About 3 weeks after moving in, we finally saw Douglas for the first time. I was hauling garbage bags to the curb on a Wednesday evening when he emerged from his side door carrying his own trash. He moved in this careful, deliberate way, like someone recovering from surgery or afraid of pulling a muscle. Mid-40s maybe, wearing a faded polo shirt and khakis that looked like they'd been washed 100 times. His hair was combed straight back with so much gel it looked wet, and he had these thick glasses that magnified his eyes to an uncomfortable size. When he noticed me, he stopped mid-step and just stared for a moment before offering this tight nod. I said hey, introduced myself, mentioned we'd just moved in. He kept nodding while I talked, his mouth slightly open like he was about to respond but couldn't quite form the words. Finally, he muttered something about keeping the noise down after 10 and hurried back inside. Ashley thought I was being dramatic when I told her the interaction made me uncomfortable. She reminded me that plenty of people were awkward or antisocial, and that didn't make them creepy. Still, I started paying more attention to the sounds from next door. The pacing happened every single night without fail, usually starting around 11:15 and continuing until at least 2 in the morning. Sometimes I'd lie awake listening, trying to map out his path through the rooms, kitchen to living room, down the hallway, pause for exactly 30 seconds, then back again. The strangest part was how consistent the timing was. like he was counting steps or following some internal metronome. During the day, we'd hear him occasionally, usually the muffled sound of his television or the microwave beeping. But those nighttime walks were constant, predictable as clockwork. One night in late May, Ashley was working a double shift and wouldn't be home until morning. I'd been trying to sleep, but the pacing seemed louder than usual, more aggressive somehow. Each footstep landed harder, and I could hear him mumbling to himself between circuits. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out words, but it was just this low, continuous stream of syllables that didn't form anything coherent. Then the pacing stopped abruptly, right in the middle of his usual route. Complete silence for maybe 5 minutes. I was just starting to relax when I heard a different sound, a soft scraping coming from inside our apartment. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, listening hard. The scraping continued for another minute or so, like metal against wood, then stopped. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed and searched the entire apartment, checking locks, peering into closets. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. Ashley got home around 7 that morning, exhausted and ready to crash. I tried explaining what had happened, but she was too tired to really process it. Said we'd talk after she got some sleep. While she was in the shower, I decided to do another check of the apartment in daylight. That's when I went into our bedroom closet to grab a clean shirt for work. As I pushed aside the hanging clothes, I noticed something odd about the back wall. There was a small pile of white dust on the floor, like drywall powder. I looked up and found it, about eye level, partially hidden behind Ashley's winter coats. A hole, perfectly round, maybe the width of a pencil. I leaned closer and could see straight through into darkness. My whole body went cold as I realized what this meant. The hole went through our wall directly into Douglas's apartment, positioned at the exact height where someone standing on the other side could look through. I backed out of the closet, legs shaking, trying to process what I'd discovered. How long had that hole been there? Had it existed before we moved in, or had Douglas drilled it recently? The scraping sound from last night suddenly made horrible sense. I thought about all the nights Ashley and I had been in that bedroom, getting dressed, sleeping, being intimate, completely unaware that we might have had an audience. My stomach churned as I remembered how the closet door usually stayed open because the track was broken and it would slide open on its own. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the hole, the drywall dust, everything. When Ashley came out of the shower, I showed her immediately. The color drained from her face as she understood what she was looking at. She kept saying, "No, no, no," like repetition could make it untrue. We stood there in our bedroom, both of us scanning the walls, wondering if there were other holes we hadn't found yet. Ashley wanted to call the police right away, but I convinced her we should check the rest of the apartment first, document everything properly. We spent the next hour going over every inch of our walls, especially the ones we shared with Douglas. We found 2 more holes, one in the bathroom behind the toilet, another in the living room concealed behind a bookshelf we'd pushed against the wall. Each one was the same size, drilled with precision, angled slightly downward like whoever made them had been standing while looking through. The bathroom one was the worst because it had a clear view of the shower. Ashley started crying when she saw it, realizing how exposed we'd been. I felt rage building in my chest, this hot, violent feeling I'd never experienced before. This man had been watching us, violating our privacy in the most intimate moments of our lives. The pacing at night took on a whole new meaning now. Was he walking from hole to hole, checking on us like we were animals in a zoo? We called the police around 9 that morning. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes, a younger guy who looked fresh out of training, and an older woman who'd clearly seen everything in her years on the job. They took our report, examined the holes, took their own photos. The older officer, Sergeant Martinez, asked if we'd noticed anything missing, or if Douglas had ever tried to make contact beyond that one encounter by the garbage. We told her about the pacing, the constant television, how he'd been doing this routine every single night. She nodded like she'd heard similar stories before, which somehow made it worse. They went next door to talk to Douglas, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway, that beige sedan that looked like it hadn't been washed in years, but no amount of knocking got a response. Sergeant Martinez said they'd need a warrant to enter without probable cause of immediate danger, but they could start the paperwork based on what we'd shown them. Frank, our landlord, arrived about an hour after the police left. He looked genuinely shocked when we showed him the holes, kept apologizing and saying Douglas had been there for 8 years without a single complaint. He authorized us to break our lease immediately, no penalties, and said he'd return our full deposit that day. He also mentioned something that made my skin prickle. The previous tenants, a young married couple, had broken their lease after only 2 months. They'd been vague about why, just said the place wasn't working out. Frank hadn't pushed for details because they'd paid a penalty to leave early. Now he wondered if they'd discovered the same thing we had, but hadn't wanted to deal with the embarrassment or legal hassle of reporting it. While Frank was talking, I noticed movement in Douglas's window. Just a quick shift of the curtains. He was in there, watching us deal with the aftermath of his sick hobby. We stayed in a motel that night. Neither of us could stand the thought of sleeping in that apartment knowing what we knew. Ashley barely spoke during the drive there, just stared out the window with her arms wrapped around herself. I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid that Douglas might be following us, but there was no beige sedan trailing behind. The motel room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning products, but it felt safer than our own home. We ordered pizza, but neither of us could eat more than a few bites. Ashley finally broke down completely, sobbing about how violated she felt, how she kept imagining him watching her in the shower, getting dressed, all those private moments that were supposed to be just hers. I held her while she cried, feeling helpless and furious at the same time. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Sergeant Martinez. She told me they'd gotten their warrant and entered Douglas's apartment that afternoon. What they found was worse than we'd imagined. His living room wall, the one he shared with us, had been turned into some kind of observation station. He'd mounted small monitors connected to tiny cameras he'd threaded through the holes, recording equipment, notebooks filled with detailed logs of our daily routines. The dates went back months before we'd even moved in, documenting the previous tenants' every move. But that wasn't the worst part. They'd found external hard drives containing hundreds of hours of footage, not just of us, but of at least 6 other couples who'd lived in that unit over the years. Douglas had been doing this for nearly a decade, perfecting his sick surveillance system with each new tenant. They'd arrested him on multiple charges, including voyeurism, stalking, and criminal trespass. He hadn't said a word during the arrest, just stared at the officers with that same blank expression I'd seen by the garbage bins. The prosecutor contacted us a few days later to discuss the case. She explained that Douglas would likely take a plea deal to avoid trial, which meant we wouldn't have to testify, but also meant he'd probably serve less time. The thought of him getting out in just a few years made me sick, but Ashley couldn't handle the idea of sitting in a courtroom describing what he'd done to us. We agreed to the plea deal. Douglas got 5 years with possibility of parole in 3, plus lifetime registration as a sex offender. It didn't feel like enough, not even close, but at least he couldn't do this to anyone else for a while. The prosecutor mentioned that they'd managed to identify and contact most of his previous victims. Some of them had noticed strange things but never put it together. Others had no idea they'd been watched for months. One couple had divorced shortly after moving out. The stress of feeling unsafe in their own home had destroyed their relationship, even though they never knew the real reason for their discomfort. Ashley and I found a new apartment on the other side of town, a 3rd-floor unit in a building with proper security and no shared walls. We had a contractor check every inch of it before we moved in, looking for any signs of tampering or hidden cameras. Even now, 6 months later, I still check the walls obsessively, running my fingers along them searching for holes that aren't there. Ashley started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, and some days are better than others. She still can't shower without checking behind the shower curtain multiple times, and she changes clothes in the dark most nights. We're working through it together, but we're different people now, more guarded, less trusting. Sometimes I wake up at 11:15 and listen for footsteps that never come. My body's still trained to Douglas's schedule. I know he's locked up, I know we're safe, but that knowledge doesn't stop the feeling that somewhere, somehow, we're still being watched. The detective told me they never figured out why Douglas did it. He never offered any explanation, never showed any remorse. Some people are just broken in ways we'll never understand, she said, and all we can do is try to protect ourselves from them. I think about that a lot, about how evil can live right next door, separated by nothing more than a thin wall and a few inches of insulation, pacing back and forth in the dark, watching, always watching. My divorce lawyer's business card was still sitting on my kitchen counter when I heard the moving truck rumble up next door on a humid Wednesday morning. 6 months of staring at that empty house through my home office window had made me paranoid about every little sound at night, so seeing actual people carrying furniture inside felt like winning a small lottery. I grabbed a 6-pack of beer from my fridge and walked over around noon, figuring it was the neighborly thing to do. Michael Anderson answered the door with paint smeared on his forearm, his wife Laura behind him unwrapping dishes from newspaper, and their teenage son Justin hauling boxes marked garage up from the basement. Medical equipment sales, elementary school teacher, high school junior. They laid out their life stories between sips of beer while we sat on their still plastic-wrapped couch. Laura kept apologizing for the mess while Michael told me about their last place in Michigan, how they'd needed a fresh start after some family drama with Laura's parents. Justin barely looked up from his phone except to ask if I knew any good spots to skateboard, which I didn't, but I appreciated him trying to engage with the old guy next door who was probably his dad's age, class of '05, making me feel every one of those years since graduation. Everything about them screamed normal suburban family for those first few weeks. Michael washing his SUV every Sunday morning, Laura planting marigolds along their front walk, Justin shooting hoops in their driveway after school. I work from home doing technical writing for a software company, basically translating engineer speak into human language, so I had a front row seat to their daily routines from my desk. October rolled in with early frost warnings, and I was actually sleeping well for the first time since signing those papers that split everything down the middle. Until that Saturday night, when metal scraping against dirt pulled me out of a dead sleep at 2:30 in the morning. My bedroom faces their backyard, and through the gap in my curtains I could make out this yellowish light, like from those portable work lamps contractors use. That steady, rhythmic digging sound kept going, shk thud, methodical and purposeful. I lay there for 20 minutes trying to convince myself they were just putting in fence posts or planting a tree. But who does yard work at 2 in the morning, and why would they need to dig for over an hour straight without stopping? Sunday morning came and I expected to see fresh soil or some new garden feature in their yard. But when I casually walked along our shared fence line pretending to check my gutters, everything looked exactly the same. Michael was out there hosing down his SUV like always, whistling some tune I didn't recognize, and he gave me his usual wave with the chamois cloth in his hand. I asked him if he'd heard any raccoons last night, fishing for some explanation, and he just laughed and said they'd all been dead asleep by 9 o'clock. Laura came out with coffee for him, wearing these fuzzy slippers shaped like bear paws, and invited me over for dinner later that week. Standing there in the bright morning sun, watching them be so perfectly ordinary, I started doubting what I'd heard, wondering if maybe the sound had come from somewhere else entirely, or if those sleeping pills my doctor prescribed were messing with my head more than I realized. But then it happened again the following Friday, and this time I was ready. I'd been lying in bed since 11, lights off but wide awake, when that same scraping started at exactly 3 in the morning. This time I didn't stay in bed. I crept to my spare bedroom, which had a better angle of their backyard, and peeked through the blinds. There was Justin, illuminated by one of those camping headlamps, dragging what looked like a heavy contractor bag across their lawn toward the shed they'd installed the week before. The kid was stronger than he looked, managing that bag with steady determination, even though it seemed to weigh nearly as much as he did. Michael stood by the shed door holding it open, and when Justin got close enough, they both lifted the bag together and disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, they came out empty-handed, and Michael put his hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him back toward the house while Justin kept wiping his hands on his jeans over and over again. I couldn't focus on work after that, spending my days staring at their backyard from my office window, watching for any sign of what they might be hiding in that shed. During a conference call about API documentation, I watched Laura hanging laundry on their clothesline, humming and acting like she didn't have a care in the world. Justin would get home from school around 3:30, drop his backpack on the porch, and shoot baskets until dinner, never once going near the shed during daylight hours. Michael started working on some project in their garage with the door open, sawing and hammering away at what looked like shelving units, occasionally calling Justin over to hold a board steady. They were playing the part of the perfect family so well that I began to question my own sanity, wondering if stress from the divorce had finally pushed me into some kind of paranoid breakdown. My ex-wife had always said I overthought everything, turned molehills into mountains, and maybe she'd been right all along. I decided to test them, to see if I could get any kind of reaction that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. That Wednesday, when Laura invited me for dinner, I accepted, showing up with a bottle of wine and my best attempt at normal conversation. Their house smelled like pot roast and fresh bread, with family photos covering every surface. Justin, at various ages, always with that same crooked smile. Michael and Laura on vacation somewhere tropical, everyone looking genuinely happy. We ate at their dining room table while Justin talked about his history project on the Cold War, and Michael shared stories from his sales trips to rural hospitals. When I mentioned casually that I'd been having trouble sleeping lately, hearing strange noises at night, Laura's fork paused halfway to her mouth for just a second before she suggested I try chamomile tea. Michael jumped in immediately, talking about how the neighborhood had tons of wildlife, possums, raccoons, even a fox family that lived in the woods behind our street. Justin stayed quiet, pushing green beans around his plate, until his father asked him about basketball tryouts, and he launched into an enthusiastic recap of practice. After dinner, Michael offered to show me the shelving he'd been building in the garage, and I followed him out through their kitchen door, noticing how Laura's smile tightened when he suggested it. The garage was meticulously organized, tools hanging on pegboard in order of size, lumber stacked against the far wall with labels indicating length and type. Michael ran his hand along one of the shelves he'd finished, explaining his process for getting the joints perfectly flush, but I kept glancing toward the backyard, toward that shed sitting in the corner of their property like a secret wrapped in aluminum siding. I asked him what they kept in there, trying to sound casual, just making conversation, and he didn't miss a beat. Lawn equipment, holiday decorations, the usual suburban overflow that doesn't fit in the garage. He even offered to show me. Started walking toward the door, but then Laura called from inside that Justin needed help with his math homework, and Michael apologized, said we'd have to do the tour another time. I went home that night more convinced than ever that they were hiding something, and I made a decision that I'm not proud of, but couldn't stop myself from following through on. I ordered one of those wildlife cameras online, the kind hunters use, with night vision and motion activation. When it arrived 2 days later, I spent an afternoon pretending to trim the bushes along our fence line while I mounted it to a tree that had a clear view of their shed. The camera was smaller than I expected, olive green plastic that blended into the bark, and I angled it just right to capture anyone approaching from their house. That first night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour for motion alerts, but nothing triggered it except a cat around midnight and what looked like a possum just before dawn. Friday came and went with no activity, Saturday too, and I started to wonder if they'd somehow noticed the camera, if they were waiting me out, playing some kind of psychological game where they knew I was watching and wanted to see how long I'd keep it up. Monday night changed everything, and I wish to God I'd never installed that camera, never looked at what it captured. The alert came through at 2:47 a.m., and when I opened the app on my phone, the infrared image showed all three of them in their backyard. But this time they weren't heading to the shed. They were standing in a circle on their lawn, each holding what looked like a small gardening trowel, and they were digging, but not in one spot. They were making a pattern, connected holes about the size of coffee cans, maybe a dozen of them arranged in some kind of shape I couldn't quite make out from the camera angle. Laura was wearing a bathrobe over pajamas, her hair tied back with what looked like a bandana, and she kept checking something on her phone, like she was following instructions or keeping track of time. Michael had on sweatpants and a hoodie, moving between the holes and measuring distances with a tape measure, making sure everything was precise. Justin looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes between digging sessions, but his parents kept him moving, Laura touching his shoulder whenever he slowed down, not roughly but insistent, like this was something that absolutely had to be finished before sunrise. Then they started bringing things out from the shed, and my mouth went completely dry watching them work with such practiced efficiency. First came small cloth bags, the kind banks use for coins, each one tied with colored string, red, blue, yellow, green, and they placed one bag in each hole with careful deliberation. Michael went back to the shed and returned with what looked like mason jars filled with dark liquid, and they poured a small amount from each jar onto the bags, the liquid soaking into the soil. The smell must have been strong because even Justin pulled his shirt up over his nose, and Laura turned her face away each time she poured. They worked in complete silence except for the occasional whispered instruction from Michael, and I realized they'd done this before, many times, because everyone knew exactly what their role was, when to move, where to stand. After the liquid came white powder from a plastic container, sprinkled over each hole like they were seasoning food. And then finally they began covering everything with dirt, patting it down flat, making the lawn look undisturbed. I sat there staring at my phone screen until the battery died, trying to process what I'd witnessed, and when I finally got up to plug it in, I noticed movement outside my window. Michael was standing at the fence line between our properties, just standing there in the darkness, facing my house. I couldn't see his expression, couldn't tell if he was looking at my window specifically or just staring at the house in general. But he stood there for what must have been 5 full minutes before turning and walking back to his house. The next morning I called in sick to work. Couldn't imagine trying to write documentation while knowing what my neighbors had buried in their yard. Around 10 o'clock, Laura knocked on my door with a plate of fresh muffins, blueberry with a crumb topping, and her smile was so warm, so genuine, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. She asked if I was feeling all right, said Michael mentioned seeing my lights on late last night, wondered if my insomnia was getting worse. I took the muffins, thanked her, told her I was fine, just work stress, and she patted my arm like a concerned mother before heading back to her house. That afternoon I couldn't stand it anymore and decided to check the fence line where I'd installed the camera, telling myself I was just making sure it was still hidden. But when I got to the tree, the camera was gone. Not damaged, not hanging loose, just gone, like it had never been there at all, and the only evidence it had existed was a small indentation in the bark where I'd secured the strap. I stood there running my fingers over that mark, and when I turned around, Justin was standing about 10 feet away, holding a basketball, just watching me. He didn't say anything at first, just bounced the ball once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp in the quiet afternoon, and then he asked if I'd lost something, if I needed help looking for it. I told him no, just checking for damage from the storm we'd had last week, even though there hadn't been any storm. And he nodded slowly, said his dad was good with tree stuff if I needed help, then walked back to his driveway and continued shooting hoops like nothing had happened. That night I lay in bed with every door locked, chair wedged under the doorknob of my bedroom door, telling myself I was being ridiculous but unable to shake the feeling that they were done playing games with me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate, followed by a gentle knock. Not urgent or aggressive, just 3 soft taps like someone dropping by to borrow sugar. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there listening as the knocking came again. Same pattern, same politeness. And then I heard Michael's voice, calm and friendly, asking if I was awake, saying he had something to show me in the shed, something that would explain everything. He waited maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard his footsteps moving away, down my porch steps, and the night went quiet again. I stayed frozen in that bed until sunrise, and when I finally worked up the courage to check my front door, there was a single manila envelope tucked into the frame. No name, no address, just sitting there waiting for me. Inside the envelope were photographs, dozens of them, all taken from angles that showed my house, my bedroom window, my home office, my backyard, even one through my kitchen window showing me making coffee. But the dates on the photos, the little timestamps in the corner, they were all from before the Andersons moved in, some going back months when the house was supposedly empty. The last photo in the stack showed me installing the camera on the tree, taken from behind, so close I could see the sweat stain on my shirt collar. On the back, someone had written in neat blue ink, "We were here first. We were always here. Stop looking or we'll have to stop being neighbors." I packed a bag that morning, threw it in my car along with my laptop and whatever clothes I could grab in 5 minutes, and drove to a motel 3 towns over. I called a real estate agent from the motel room, told them to list my house immediately, take whatever offer came first. I didn't care about the money anymore. The house sold in 2 weeks to a cash buyer who waived inspection, which should have been my first red flag, but I was too relieved to care. I signed the papers electronically, never went back to collect the rest of my things, just had a moving company pack everything up and put it in storage. Started over in a different state, got a small apartment near downtown where there were always people around, always lights and noise and activity. For months I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, heart racing, waiting to hear that scraping sound, but it never came. Slowly I started to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood everything. Maybe they were just eccentric people with weird hobbies. Maybe the photos had been taken by a previous owner or some real estate company doing market research. Then about a year later, I was mindlessly scrolling through news articles when I saw it. A story about human remains being discovered in Pine Valley Road during construction of a new development. The house next to mine had been demolished, and when they started excavating for the foundation, they found bones, lots of them, some dating back decades. The article mentioned that the previous owners, a family of 3, had disappeared without a trace, leaving no forwarding address, no trail to follow. I still think about the Andersons sometimes, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and the room is too quiet. I wonder if they're out there somewhere, living next to someone else now, washing their car on Sunday mornings, bringing over casseroles, burying things in patterns under cover of darkness. I changed my name after I moved, deleted all my social media, got a new phone number, did everything I could to disappear, but sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks like Michael at the grocery store, or hear a laugh that sounds like Laura's, or see a teenager bouncing a basketball with that same steady rhythm. Once, twice, 3 times. And I know it's not them. It can't be them, they don't know where I am. But I still leave the store immediately, still drive a different route home, still check my locks twice before bed. Because the thing that haunts me most isn't what they were burying or why they were doing it. It's that note, those 5 words that made everything clear. We were always here. They weren't the new neighbors moving in next to me. I was the one who'd moved in next to them, and whatever they were doing, whatever they were hiding, I'd gotten too close to something that was never meant to be found. There was a time when quiet meant safety to me. My house sat at the very end of a small cul-de-sac, surrounded by elm trees that rustled even when there was no wind. The neighborhood had a strange kind of calm, the kind that made every sound stand out, like a door creak or the distant bark of a dog. I'd moved there for peace after a long and messy breakup, and my days were a mix of remote work, long walks, and late nights reading by the kitchen window. I barely knew anyone until the old man next door, Mr. Henry Lawson, started showing up with a basket of muffins or pie every few days. He had that gentle, old-fashioned politeness that made me think of another era. Henry lived alone in the house across the street, the one with the ivy crawling up the porch rails and the heavy green shutters. He liked to talk about how the cul-de-sac used to be full of families, how the kids ran through the sprinklers right there, pointing at the patch of grass between our driveways. His stories were warm at first, and I liked listening. He would smile, his eyes almost hidden behind thick glasses, and talk about good neighbors, good times. But after a while, I started noticing how he always seemed to glance toward his basement door, as if making sure it was still closed every time I visited. The first odd thing happened one night in early autumn. I was closing my kitchen window when I heard a metallic clang, followed by a dull thud that seemed to come from Henry's house. It was late, nearly midnight, and the sound was so distinct that I turned off the lights just to listen. There it was again, like something heavy being dragged on concrete. I told myself maybe he was moving furniture or storing tools. But when I looked out, I saw a faint yellow light flickering through the narrow basement window on his side of the house. It went out seconds later, leaving the yard in complete darkness. The next day, I brought up the noise casually. Henry chuckled and said he had been fixing his furnace. His tone was friendly, but something about the way he tightened his grip on the pie plate caught my attention. He thanked me for checking in, then quickly changed the subject, asking if I liked pecan or apple better. I noticed his hands were rough, like someone who still did heavy work despite his age. When he walked me to the door, he locked it right after I stepped out. I heard the click before I even reached the gate. At the time, I laughed it off as an old man's habit, but that sound of the lock turning stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. A few evenings later, I was walking back from the mailbox when I saw Henry outside, kneeling beside his garden shed. He was digging into the soil, carefully piling dirt into a wheelbarrow. When he noticed me, he smiled and waved, but there was something odd about how quickly he covered the hole with a tarp. I asked if he needed help, and he said it was just old pipes, his voice softer than usual. Behind him, the basement door stood wide open for the first time, and I caught a glimpse of stairs leading down into dim light. A chill went through me, not fear exactly, but a sense that I had stepped too close to something private. Later that night, it started again. Scraping, slow and rhythmic, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I pressed my ear against the wall that faced his house and waited. For a moment, there was nothing, and then 3 sharp knocks echoed through the quiet like someone hitting metal. I nearly called the police, but stopped myself. How would that sound? My neighbor's basement is making noises? It felt ridiculous. So I sat there, lights off, watching that same narrow basement window glow faintly again. The light swayed as if someone was walking with a lantern. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. The next afternoon, I made a reason to visit, returning his pie dish. He invited me in, cheerful as always, and I immediately noticed how cold the house was. It smelled faintly of bleach and old paper. We talked in the kitchen for a while until he excused himself to check something downstairs. I waited until I heard the lock click behind him before stepping quietly toward the hallway. The basement door was heavy, reinforced with a thick padlock that looked newer than the rest of the house. Beside the door, an old framed photograph caught my attention. Several people standing on the same street, all smiling. I recognized none of them except Henry, decades younger, standing right where my house would be built years later. That night, I searched for the street name online, just out of curiosity. What I found made my heart pound. A few old newspaper scans mentioned disappearances from this exact block, 3 different people, spread over 20 years. The reports were vague, mentioning no signs of forced entry and residents last seen near the end of the cul-de-sac. In 2 of the articles, the name Henry Lawson appeared as a witness who reported unusual noises, or was among the last to see the missing person. I stared at his picture in the article. The same calm expression, the same faint smile. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but the more I read, the harder that became. The next morning, I saw him standing in his yard, trimming the hedges like any other day. The normalcy of it unsettled me. I could not stop thinking about those articles. I printed them out and kept them on my table, reading and rereading the lines that mentioned his name. At one point, I glanced out the window and realized he was watching me. Not directly. His head was tilted just enough that I could see the reflection of my house in his glasses. When our eyes finally met, he smiled and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. That night, the noises started again, louder than before. Around 3 in the morning, I called the police. I told them there was a disturbance next door and that I believed someone might be hurt. They came within 20 minutes, 2 officers walking up his driveway with flashlights. I watched from my window as Henry opened the door in his robe, calm as ever. They talked for a few minutes. Then one of the officers laughed at something he said. After a short look around the backyard, they left. Henry stood there for a while after they were gone, just staring at my window before slowly going back inside. The next day, a pie tin sat on my porch filled with cookies and a small note that read, "No hard feelings, neighbor." I barely slept that week. I packed a small bag and decided to stay with a friend across town for a few days. But before leaving, I felt compelled to check something. The old police reports had mentioned a storm drain that connected several properties on our street, one entrance behind Henry's shed. I went out early that morning and walked around to the back of his fence. The air smelled damp, metallic. I found the drain partially hidden by vines and crouched down. Inside, barely visible in the dark, was the glint of a chain and something else. Fabric, pale and torn. I stepped back so fast I nearly fell, my heartbeat filling my ears. I moved out 2 weeks later. The house sold quicker than I expected, and I never went back to that neighborhood. I did call the police again, anonymously this time, and told them about the drain. Whether they ever looked into it, I will never know. Every now and then I search Henry Lawson's name online. Nothing new ever comes up. But sometimes when the nights are too quiet, I catch myself listening, waiting for that faint metallic sound that used to echo from his basement, the one that told me I was never really alone on that street. It started with something small, a cracked fence post between my yard and the man next door. I remember noticing it after a storm that had torn through the area overnight. The wooden panels leaned slightly toward my side, and when I mentioned it to him, he said it was probably my fault for letting my shrubs grow too close. His name was Howard, a retired mechanic who spent most of his days sitting on his porch with a can of beer. We weren't friends, but I had always tried to be polite. Until that day, we had never exchanged more than a few neighborly words. At first, I figured our little argument would blow over. People get touchy about property lines. I offered to split the cost of repairs, but he just walked away mid-sentence, muttering something I couldn't catch. A week later, I noticed he'd parked his old truck in a way that blocked part of my driveway. The next morning, there were dead potted plants tossed onto my lawn, their roots exposed, soil scattered like ashes. I didn't have proof it was him, but who else would do something like that? Things kept escalating in quiet, unsettling ways. The motion light above my garage started flickering every night, always around the same hour. I replaced the bulb, checked the wiring. It wasn't that. One evening, I caught him standing on his porch staring straight at my kitchen window while I washed dishes. He didn't look away, didn't move, just stood there with this blank expression, his beer can resting against the railing. It wasn't rage on his face or even amusement. It was emptiness, like he was waiting for something. That's when I decided to call the city and report him for harassment and illegal dumping. I didn't want to, but I was tired of feeling watched. The officer I spoke to said they'd send someone by to talk to him. For a couple of days, things were quiet. Then one night, the power went out across the whole block. I thought it was just another outage, until I saw a faint shape near the fence line, standing perfectly still, right inside my backyard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The moonlight barely reached the backyard, but I could see enough to make out the outline of someone near the fence. I stood still by the window, hoping maybe it was a tree or a shadow from a neighbor's yard. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately, closer to the house. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I didn't grab my phone right away because I didn't want to draw attention with the light. I just stayed there, watching, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. The figure stepped under the porch light, and even though the power was out, there was just enough glow from a nearby street lamp to see the jacket. It was Howard's. That same faded denim jacket he wore every day, the one with oil stains on the sleeves. He wasn't holding a flashlight. He wasn't holding anything. He was just standing there, facing the back door like he was waiting for it to open. I crouched down behind the counter, clutching my house keys so tightly they left marks in my hand. After what felt like forever, he turned toward the side gate. I heard the latch rattle, but it didn't open. I realized I had locked it earlier that evening. Thank God. Then came the sound of footsteps circling the side of the house, slow and dragging. My dog, Benny, started whining from under the table. He never barked, just whimpered, like he knew we weren't supposed to make a sound. I stayed crouched there, counting the seconds between each step until everything went silent again. Minutes later, the hum of the refrigerator kicked back in. The power had returned. The light flickered on, and I ran to the front window to see if he was still outside. The porch was empty. His truck was gone. But something caught my eye near the curb. A trail of wet footprints leading from my backyard to the street, faint but visible under the lamplight. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt sharper, every creak louder, and I kept picturing that jacket in the dark. The next morning, I went outside and found that part of the fence had been pushed inward again, this time splintered at the base. A muddy boot print sat right beside it. I took photos and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the prints had mostly dried, and they said there wasn't enough to go on. One of the officers knocked on Howard's door, but no one answered. His truck wasn't there either. They told me to call if he came back, though they didn't sound convinced it was serious. Maybe they deal with too many neighbor disputes to see when one is different. Over the next few days, I barely left the house. Every creak from the porch made me tense up. I started keeping a flashlight and a kitchen knife near the bed, just in case. Then, one afternoon, a city inspector came by to confirm the harassment complaint I had filed. He said Howard had been issued a warning notice but hadn't been seen at his address since. Apparently the house belonged to his brother, who told them Howard had moved out suddenly and left most of his belongings behind. I asked if that included his truck. The inspector said no. There was no truck in the driveway when they went by. For a while, things actually went quiet. The lights stayed steady, the fence untouched. I even started sleeping better. But about 2 weeks later, a small brown package showed up on my doorstep. No return address, no label. Inside was a single photo, printed on cheap glossy paper. It was a picture of my backyard, taken from outside the fence in the dark. The back door was open, and I was standing in the kitchen facing away from the camera. I called the police again, but they couldn't trace where the package came from. They suggested maybe it was a prank, and that I should install security cameras. I did. For months, nothing happened. No one appeared, no more packages. Still, Every time the power flickers or the motion light clicks on, I find myself staring through that same window, expecting to see a figure in a denim jacket standing by the fence, waiting for me to step outside.